Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring television. The Elroom by Sohl. The Show Must Go On by Slesar. Shatter the Wall by Sydney Van Scyoc. Star Bright by Bryce Walton. The Walls by Laumer. The Elroom by Sohl, originally published in Worlds of If Science Fiction, March 1955. Narrated by Trussel. She had never seen violinists work so hard. They were running their bows back and forth so fast the hands were blurred. The musicians' faces were studies in concentration, and the concertmaster, he wasn't 2 feet from her, had worked himself into such a frenzy veins were standing out on his red face. Mrs. Briggs almost laughed, the way the conductor was sweeping his baton to within inches of her head. Several times she had an impulse to reach up and catch it. So this was Virilio, disjointed, cacophonic, sometimes sweet, but more often deafening. She had never caught him before, but it was just as advertised, all right, exciting and moving. She didn't know if there was supposed to be a love theme in Virilio's new plenitude on a Thursday afternoon, but it definitely stirred her. Just then the door opened, and Timmy came walking through the musicians eating an apple. Once he stopped to stare at the timpani, and a second fiddler's bow kept running through his head. It was rather ghostly, Mrs. Briggs thought. "Timmy!" she yelled above the music. "I didn't see you go. Where have you been?" As if she didn't know. "Had to get a glass of water. The music made me thirsty," he said loudly, taking his seat beside her. "This is a lousy program, Mum. What's next?" "Drama and history," she said absently, her eyes on a flutist's moustache, wondering how he managed to play. Timmy chomped on his apple, but in the face of his gustatory enjoyment, she couldn't find the heart to tell him to be quiet. At intermission, she left the Elroom to let Timmy take in the commercial, and returned in time for the beginning of Drama in History. There was a salt spray in the air, and a cool wind whipped around them as the lights went out completely. The roar of waves grew loud, and the deck creaked beneath their feet. The ship moved through the dim light. Sailors stood like statues about the deck. "We're even with the inshore ships, sir," a voice called hoarsely. "We've got the French between us, then." Though he was a small man, there was a ring of authority in the voice of the man on the bridge. "There's the Orient, sir. One of ours has gone aground." "She'll mark the shoal for the rest of the fleet," the little man replied calmly. "Ready, Mr. Creston." "What's he think he's doing?" the cabin's boy whispered. "Quiet, lad," a peg-legged sailor said softly. "Admiral Nelson will see us through. You'll have your share of action afore morning, mate." The darkness was split by faraway flashes of light. Instantly there was returning cannon fire that caused the ship to shudder and groan. The Battle of Aboukir Bay had begun. The red flashes above the door winked their message. "Damn," Mrs. Briggs said, switching off. "Ah, there's someone at the door, Timmy. If it's a salesman—" Mrs. Briggs checked the dials on the electric cooker as she went to the door. A small but efficient-looking woman in the standard white and blue of school uniforms had alighted from a G-car and stood at the door. The woman said she was Bernice Pomeroy from the office of the director of Timmy's public school, and Mrs. Briggs, scarcely glancing at her offered identification card, pushed for mezzanine. The woman said nothing. She merely waited until the floor came down hydraulically to mezz level. Then Mrs. Briggs ran the magnetic curtains around, and when they were private, she saw that the woman was sitting on one of the soft lounge cushions, straight-backed, adjusting her glasses on the small bridge of her nose. She drew a sheaf of papers from her portfolio. "Mrs. Briggs," Miss Pomeroy said, looking up with officious grey eyes. Then she saw Timmy. "Timmy, I suppose?" "Yes." Mrs. Briggs wished she'd get on with it. It was hard enough leaving Admiral Nelson at the mouth of the Nile without having a settling down as if for all day. "Maybe it would be best," Miss Pomeroy coughed a little, If Timmy what? It's about him, you see." "I'll send him to the Elroom." "No," Miss Pomeroy said at once. Then she added, "Perhaps it would be best if she stayed after all." She riffled her papers. "Timmy's latest Orden Grenade test shows his personality has dropped at least 5 points from positive during the first half of the school year." Mrs. Briggs looked at her 9-year-old son. He was down to the core of his apple now, a nice-looking boy, she thought, with bright blue eyes, hair that insisted on drooping too far down on his forehead. She'd have to start training it in earnest soon, and a fair supply of freckles. He carried himself well, had a pleasant speaking voice, she thought, and a good vocabulary. She had noticed no slipping. "Timmy's not too far behind factually, Mrs. Briggs," Miss Pomeroy said, referring to her records. "In fact, we'll admit he is ahead in stability and adjustment, but he's getting more negative in aggressiveness and personality development. He just doesn't seem to care. That factor may account for his stability. He doesn't have any reason to be unstable, you see, and he adjusts easily because he doesn't care enough not to. There is a reason, of course." Mrs. Briggs was annoyed. The schools had gone too far. "And what, may I ask, is the reason?" "Too much time in the Elroom, Mrs. Briggs." Mrs. Briggs managed a good-natured laugh. "Miss Pomeroy, you have Timmy all wrong. He doesn't spend any more time in the Elroom than other children do." "Children are all different," Miss Pomeroy countered, "but not Timmy." "Parents are often poor judges of their own children, Mrs. Briggs." "Are you trying to tell me I don't know my own child?" "Mrs. Briggs, I'm not trying to tell you anything." Miss Pomeroy's cheeks were red. "I am telling you your child is spending too much time watching these programs, sublimating so much, in fact, that he's beginning to find it difficult telling the difference between life itself and the Elroom." "Sublimating?" "Escape. You didn't know." "Yes." The teacher smiled tolerantly. "First sublimation room for elevating oneself. Sublime the verb. Then sub-L for short. Then just L, and Elroom to Elroom. You didn't know?" "That, my dear," Mrs. Briggs said heatedly, "is just so much hogwash." "Tell me, Mrs. Briggs, just what does your husband think of the Elroom?" "He doesn't have much time to spend in it." "You mean he'd rather do something else?" "He's interested in typically man things, cars mostly." Because Timmy had gone over to the curtains and starting to walk through, and because she wanted to show Miss Pomeroy she was capable of some discipline, she said, "And where are you going, young man?" "Probably back to the Elroom," Miss Pomeroy put in. Mrs. Briggs gave her an acid look. Timmy swallowed the last bite of apple. "To get a drink, I'm thirsty." Then he had gone. Miss Pomeroy leaned forward. "You must keep him out of the Elroom, Mrs. Briggs. We'll send you a list of programs. He can have sublimation only 1 hour a day." "Ridiculous," Mrs. Briggs snapped. Miss Pomeroy adjusted her glasses and looked at her severely. "Are you saying you will not comply?" "I said it's ridiculous, didn't you hear?" "Why, you won't find a better child than Timmy." "Obviously, your only child." "And what has that to do with it?" "It's not my job to explain," Miss Pomeroy said icily, "only to inform. I'm afraid I'll have to report that you will not heed the directive." "The Elroom is instructive. Why, we were learning something about history just now. We're watching Nelson sink the French fleet when you came." "It's not the program. It's the identification with it. Let's say Timmy has too much imagination. But then I have already told you what I came to tell. I'll be going now, Mrs. Briggs." From the way George sent the gyrocar into a long swoop that ended inside the garage, Laura Briggs knew her husband was angry, and she braced herself for battle. But she wasn't quite prepared for such an immediate outburst the moment he got in the door. "Stoops!" he cried, robbed of slamming the door because of the automatic permaglass cushion. Timmy scurried away, frightened at this aspect of his father. "The psycho centre we've got to go to yet!" The electro-cooker had dinged a minute ago, and Mrs. Briggs was ready to take everything out and put it on the table. But she could only look at him in amazement. "You're not making sense." "Ha!" George's heavy eyebrows hovered high in his forehead, then plunged down over his eyes. His big face was crimson, his blue eyes steely. "Neither are they, and they called just before I left the office. Wouldn't tell me why. Have you done anything?" "Well," Mrs. Briggs started tentatively, and he gave her a sharp look. "It's about the Elroom." "The Elroom." She told him about the visit of Miss Pomeroy. "She must have reported it." "Then we'll get rid of the damn thing." His eyes brightened. "I told you we should have gotten a new car instead." "But we've got a car, George." "Not a good one." He leaned against the cooker, his face blissful. "Imagine us, driving a new Caddy gyro. Room for 8, you know, supersonic drive, sleek, too. We could get a red one. You like red, wouldn't you? 1,000 horsepower with twin turbos for level flight, and those off-center firing tubes with folding back overhead vertical flight pins. Gad. Our present car, junk. But it runs, and we don't need a car like that for just in-town driving." "But what about our vacation? Think of it, Laura. We could make it to Alaska, Tibet, Africa. We could go around the world in our 3 weeks." "We could do the same with the Elroom, George, and there are a lot more things besides travel." Mrs. Briggs' lower lip was trembling. "You're siding with those nasty school people. You think they're right about Timmy." "Where is he?" Timmy stuck his head up from behind the lounge. His big eyes were wide. "Look at him, George. Ever seen a more normal boy? How could they think a boy like that could get so involved in a program he'd think he was living it?" "Yeah, but if those school people—" Her eye caught the clock, and she drew in her breath quickly. "Say, we've got to hurry if we're going to see Cameron Capers." Dr. Vincent Potter was a large man with a shining expanse of flesh between 2 islands of black bristling hair above heavy brows that met over his nose and almost concealed the bright, intelligent eyes that glittered beneath them. "So, you cannot understand?" "Yes." He nodded his head, made a tent with his hands, and rocked. "But this is what we are for, to understand. For you." He smiled. "If understanding easily came, then we would be not needed. No, you see?" He laughed a little, jerked upright. The movement nearly made the 3 of them jump. "Doctor," George said, "there are millions of kids in Elrooms all over the country." "You tell me something new?" The doctor frowned. "Millions of people there are. So? Must they be alike, everyone? They are not, yes?" The doctor leaned toward Timmy, who was playing with a desk calendar. "Who is your mother?" Timmy pointed to Mrs. Briggs. "Your father?" Timmy pointed to George. "See, he knows." "Of course," Mrs. Briggs said. "Exactly," the doctor agreed. Then he was upright, waving his forefinger before them, looking from beneath dark brows. "For how long, Mrs. Briggs? For how long, I am asking. And now I am telling how long. Who knows? Who can tell how many times you will let him see these things?" "What day is it today?" Timmy asked. "He is asking what day it is," the doctor laughed. "Well, why don't you answer him?" Mrs. Briggs suggested. "The 12th of June," the doctor said. "And why does Timmy ask such a question?" "You forgot to tear off yesterday." And Timmy tore the little sheet off, proceeded to make a dart of it. "Well, what you've been meaning to say," George said, "is that we're going to have to cut down on Timmy's Elroom time." "Oh, Dad!" Timmy protested. No, cut it down we will not do. The doctor shook his head gravely. We will cut it out altogether. Cut it out? George said hopefully. He leaned forward with interest. Maybe we should get rid of our outfit. Mr. Briggs, you do not know, perhaps. Sublimation can be dangerous. Confusing reality, stimulating unreality, stunting thinking, bringing on neuroses. Tolerance. He needs tolerance. Timmy cannot develop tolerance with too much of a dose, as he has had. Do you see now? The AG test? Ah, it is good. It shows us he is leaving reality. We can't let him psychotic become. But he doesn't believe the programs, Mrs. Briggs exclaimed. Not yet, Mrs. Briggs, not yet. If he sublimes enough, he will soon. Though, no. I can't stand the thought of locking Timmy out of it, Mrs. Briggs said sadly. I'm in favour of getting rid of it, George muttered. There are other things. Cars. Dr. Potter took an official form from a drawer. A change of environment you need. Timmy needs. You leave tomorrow on a month's vacation. But my vacation doesn't come up for 6 months, George said. Or doesn't that matter? He added hopefully. You will leave tomorrow, as said. No? Your office will I inform of the necessary departure. Sector administration will be knowing. He wrote on a sheet of paper. The colourful spots that you will see. Timmy will see things as they really are. Itineraries will be sent the route by facsimile. Good? Not? Why, I think it's wonderful, George said. Timmy must see the sunrise. This sea he must swim in. Things he must do, remember, yes? Yes, George said. No? He turned to his wife. There's an agency where we can rent a car, and they have new caddies. The tapering white obelisk thrust upward from the earth like a giant needle. The Briggses entered the base of it, went up the elevator, and caught glimpses of stairway landings as the cage rose slowly. When they stepped out on the platform near the top, they walked to the pair of port openings on one side and looked out. In the time it had taken them to get to the top of Washington Monument, a light fog, borne on the slight evening breeze, had enveloped the tall shaft at its midsection. They could see nothing of the ground below. They were isolated from Earth, connected to it only by the elevator well. "Isn't this eerie?" Mrs. Briggs asked Timmy. He looked around casually and yawned. "On an Elroom program," he said, "you will be able to see all the way down. I don't think this is so hot." He yawned again. "I'm thirsty." "We'll be going down in a minute, Timmy." "I've got the route figured better than itineraries for the next stop," George said. "If we could leave in 20 minutes. Aragonite crystals on the cavern ceiling twinkled brightly in reflection of glowing electric lights. The fragile beauty of the boxwork formation took Mrs. Briggs's breath away. "It's just like lace," she whispered to George, pointing to the frosty tracery glistening in the honeycombed walls. "Tom Bingham discovered this cave," the guide intoned before the tourists seated in the giant chamber, his voice echoing from the walls. "He heard a whistling sound and found it came from a small opening. That's why they call this Wind Cave. The wind goes in and out." "Why does it do that?" someone asked. "Difference in atmospheric pressure," the guide said. "Another interesting thing about this cave is always 47 degrees. Doesn't make any difference whether it's summer or winter. Always the same in here." "I don't hear any wind," Timmy said to his mother and father. "Why isn't the wind whistling?" "When the barometer falls, the wind blows out," his father explained. "When the barometer rises, the wind blows in." "Why isn't the wind whistling now?" Timmy insisted. "The barometer must be standing still, son." "This isn't any good. On an Elroom program the wind would be whistling." "Hush," Mrs. Briggs said. "I'm thirsty," Timmy said. "We'll be leaving in a few minutes. You'll get plenty of wind when I rev up the caddy on our next hop," George said. "Think of that," George said. "It's a whole mile down to the river." Timmy leaned forward to take a deep look over the precipice at Yaki Point. "Boy," he said, "this is pretty good. Almost makes me dizzy." Below, the Colorado River was bright quicksilver, threading its way circuitously through the canyon. The striated walls rose majestically from the floor to towering temples. The boy turned from the rock to look at the tufts of clouds floating by in the deep blue sky. "I'm thirsty," he said. Mrs. Briggs, still fascinated by the view, said, "Well, go get a drink then." Timmy walked over the edge, screamed as he fell. Mrs. Briggs could only stare, stunned. George uttered a cry and ran to the cliff's rim. Tourists nearby ran up, looked down with George. 100 feet below, on the slope at a point where it dropped off to nothing, a horrified Timmy was crouched, clutching a small tree. "Hold on," George called encouragingly. A few minutes later, someone had found a long rope in a gyrocar trunk and roped it about George's middle. They let him over the edge gently, dropped him down the slope slowly. "Hang on, Timmy," George yelled, running a tongue over dry lips and momentarily closing his eyes to the dizzying depths. "Don't let the little rocks coming down worry you." A while later, a dust-streaked Timmy was back on the ledge in his mother's arms, sobbing. George, his shirt wet with sweat, and struggling out of the rope, panted, "Whatever come over you, Timmy?" "It was so real I thought it was the Elroom. I was just going out to the kitchen to get a drink of water." "And I told him to go," Mrs. Briggs said, horrified. "It was that real to me too." "For sale. Elroom, complete. Like new. Reasonable. Or will trade for new Cadillac 8-passenger twin-turbo gyro, red preferred. George Briggs, 7228, Rose Terrace. Phone, Carberry, 7/9087.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
The Show Must Go On by Henry Slesar, originally published in Infinity, July 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. He awoke in darkness, trembling with the thought of escape. His hands groped around the floor, trying its solidity. Then he crawled forward with agonizing slowness until his fingertips found a wall. He raised himself to his feet, his cheek scraping at the cool surface of the enclosure. An idea came to him, and he slapped at the pocket of his shirt. His palm struck the outline of something. Matches. He lit one and raised it to the level of his wide, frightened eyes. He was facing a door, a barricade of steel, without sign of latch or doorknob. But there was a sign, and he read it in the flicker of the match flame. It said, "Push." He made a noise in his throat and shoved against the door. It gave in to his weight, and he was outside the building, standing in a courtyard washed softly by moonlight. He circled where he stood, and knew he was a prisoner still. A wire fence, 4 times his height, surrounded him. He came closer to it, and plunged his fingers through the mesh, rattling it helplessly in his misery. Then he saw the second sign, and held his breath. It read, "You can do it." Encouraged, he began his climb. The toes of his rubber-soled shoes fit neatly into the openings, and he gained the summit of the fence quickly. He swayed uncertainly at the top, and almost dropped the 25 feet to the other side. But he regained his balance, clambered down the mesh, and dropped panting to the ground. A voice boomed at him. "All right, let's go. We haven't got all night." He forced himself to his feet and looked for the source of the sound with wild movements of his head. He could see nothing but the menacing shadows of a crowded forest. With a frightened glance over his shoulder, he plunged into the thick of it, hoping to find a pathway to the unknown freedom he sought. He thrashed through the tangled vines for a small eternity, and then gave up with a sob. He fell against a tree trunk, dampening the bark with his tears. This time the voice was quieter, but its tone was impatient. Keep going, to the right, the right." He clung to the tree as if for protection, and then, with a gasp, plunged once more into the darkness. He found the clearing to the right. It was like an arena, with spectator trees, and with bright eyes winking at him through the leaves. There was a log to the left of the cleared green circle, and a frail young girl in torn clothing sat on it, huddled with either fear or cold. She was clutching something like an infant to her chest. He came closer, and saw that it was a broadsword. He paused. "Who are you?" he said. She looked up at him, her expression savage. "You're here," she said. He took a step forward, and the voice spoke once more. "Kill her, and you go free." "No," he shouted. "Kill him, and go free," said the voice. The girl put her head in her arms. Her shoulders shook. He walked towards her, and she screamed. "No, please," he said painfully. "I won't hurt you. Why should I hurt you?" She looked at him narrowly. Her hand tightened around the handle of the sword. "You know why," she accused. "You must trust me," he said. He put his hand out gently to her. She backed away from his touch and leaped off the log. She moved away cautiously, gripping the weapon with both hands. "Use the sword," said the voice. "Strike, and go free." She trembled and lifted the sword from the ground. The man whirled, eyes penetrating the forest for an escape route. He backed up and fell over a trailing root. "Now," said the voice, "strike!" The girl moved toward him hypnotically. "I hate you," she moaned. She lifted the blade high, and the man lashed out with his foot as he towered over him. The broadsword flew from her grasp. "Now kill her," said the voice, "and you can go free." "I won't," he shouted again. He scrambled to his feet and made a dive for the weapon. He took it in his hand and waved it threateningly at the surrounding woods. "Come out! Come out!" he screamed. The eyes of the forest blinked back at him in silence. He flung the sword from his hand as if in loathing. Then he crashed into the forest once more. The producer gurgled through his hookah-matic. Frick, his assistant, recognized this symptom of official disgust and jumped to his feet. "Turn it off," the producer said, gesturing toward the Fidelivision screen. Frick turned it off. "No, leave it on," the producer moaned, peeping at the white oblong through his chubby fingers. "Let's see what Manford does in this pickle." Frick turned it on. "He'll probably drop in the dinosaur film," he said. "If he does, I get a new director," the producer answered in a rumbling voice. "He's used that spot 3 times in the past month." The Fidelivision flashed. A screaming red title dripped bloodily across the screen. "Man against dinosaur," it said. The producer's angry cry almost drowned out the horrific roar of the live prop brontosaurus that appeared. "Meeting! Meeting!" he cried. "We're going to have a staff meeting right after the show." "A live meeting?" Frick gasped. "A live one," the producer said. "Everybody here, right here, in person. This is an emergency." "Gosh, TD," Frick frowned disapprovingly. "That's kind of rough, isn't it? I mean, a phone screen session would be a lot simpler. It'll take hours for Manford and the rest of them to get through the jam." "I don't care," the producer said petulantly. This kind of bumbling inefficiency has gone far enough. It'll do him good to get crushed in the traffic for a change." Frick paled, obviously disturbed by the severity of the punishment the producer was meting out. Only the lowest ranks of employees, the non-executives, the factory people, were forced to suffer the indignities of the jam. "I'm sure they'll get that fellow," Frick said. "After all, TD, how far can he get? When he gets out of the forest, he'll reach the studio barrier, and he'll be stopped. Simple as that." "And what if he finds the exit?" Frick scoffed. "Well, the odds on that—" "Odds? Don't talk to me about odds, Frick." The producer winced as man and Brontosaurus came together on the screen. There was a close-up of the man's face, and his expression wasn't pretty when he saw the imitation beast. But of course, he couldn't know it was harmless. "The letters," the producer groaned. "The complaints! I can see him now." The office door opened. A pretty redhead with vacant eyes and a frozen smile poked a head inside. "What is it, Miss Stitch?" "Will you take a call from Mr. Manford? Phone screen 7. "You bet I will," the producer said menacingly. Frick lowered the Findelivision sound and flicked on PS7 with a few efficient motions. The face of Joe Manford, the director of the night's thrill show, was haggard despite the jovial smile. "Hi, TD," he said. "Been watching the show?" "Yes, Joseph," the producer said gravely. "Oh," the smile faded, but only for a moment. "Well, nothing to worry about. Our boys will have that fellow rounded up in a few minutes. Can't imagine how that got fouled up. But that's the thrill show for you, full of surprises." "Is that a fact?" said the producer. He picked up the butt of his hook-o-matic and sipped smoke calmly. "I presume this fellow was fully authorized before you put him on?" "Oh, yes," Manford said hastily. "He passed the routine FCC physical and had the usual adrenaline and hypnomechanical dose. I mean, you saw the girl, didn't you? She was fine, wasn't she?" He beamed. "Yes," said the producer. "She certainly was fine." Frick stirred uncomfortably behind him. "Anyway," the director continued, "we're dropping in the dinosaur film. That's always good for a few shivers, and we've sent a crew into the studio to get that man out of there." The producer nodded his head toward his assistant. "Frick," he said, eyes on Manford, "you tell him." Frick stepped into range. He cleared his throat and looked at the floor. "There'll be a meeting after the show," he mumbled. "Meeting?" Manford said. "What for?" He blinked and looked at Frick's bowed head. Then he looked dazed. "You don't mean a live meeting?" Frick nodded. The producer puffed contentedly on his hook-o-matic. He blew a smoke ring, and it puffed itself to pieces against the phone screen. The man raised himself from the ground. His limbs felt weak, and he had to force the breaths through his lungs. He got to his feet, feeling somewhat stronger. The forest seemed as impenetrable as ever, but he faced its challenge now with more confidence. That girl, he thought. My God, she was really going to kill him. He shook his head bewilderedly. Such a young, pretty girl. What had he done to her? What made her want to do it? He moved through the forest slowly, ducking branches, trailing the sources of dim lights in the distance. But as he approached, they proved to be illusory, odd reflections of moonlight among the trees. She didn't want to kill him. Not really. He could sense that. It was something more. She was compelled to do it. That was it. Someone had put her up to it. But who? Who hated him enough? The speculation made his head ache. He blanked out his thoughts and decided to concentrate on his predicament. There had to be a way out. The girl had entered the forest at some point. But where? He heard the sound of voices, and he stopped breathing. "Manford means business," one of them said. "He's plenty worried. TD was watching tonight." "The sponsors kick TD. TD kicks Manford, and Manford kicks us. Who do we kick?" "I don't know about you. I got an old dog home." "OK, let's separate and find this bird." "Right. Hey, Lou, let's have some tracer lights." He concealed himself in the brush as a burst of light exploded over the treetops. He watched the men parade past, ordinary-looking men, executive types with white collars and knit ties and flannel suits. Strangely enough, they seemed quite at home in this wilderness. He waited until they passed his hiding place. Then he started on a nimble run in the direction from which they had come. The producer fitted himself snugly into executive position. Desk, swivel chair, and man welded into one solid, efficient unit. He sighed a comfortable sigh and glanced up at the wall clock. 10:30. The thrill show would be over in half an hour. The dinosaur film would wind it up neatly. He'd probably have some explaining to do to the sponsors tomorrow, but he was all prepared to give the usual popular demand argument. He regretted the live meeting he had called. It would be 2 hours at least before the staff ploughed through the traffic jam. That meant he couldn't leave the office until after 1:30. He looked at the hopeless tower of papers on his desk blotter. Most of them were letters, and his secretary had never quite gotten the hang of weeding out the chaff. Once he found a letter from an FBC vice president in the discard file. Since then, he ordered all mail to his desk. He wished he could get a better secretary than Miss Stitch, but the shortage of A1-rated secretaries, A for attractiveness, 1 for efficiency, was acute. He skimmed through the top of the pile quickly. "Dear Mr. Donnelly, certainly enjoyed Death in the Ring, one of the best thrill shows I've ever seen. Wonder if you would consider a football thriller I have in mind called Murder Kicks Off." "Dear Mr. Donnelly, let's have more shows like Snake Pit. That mother and baby idea was the greatest. I really thought that woman would go nuts when she saw her kid with the cobra. A shocker all the way." "Dear Mr. Donnelly, if Kiss of Death was your idea of entertainment, you ought to retire. Sort of sex schmaltz went out with television. Give us real gutsy stuff and never mind the mush. I'm only 11 years old, but I'll bet I could write a better scenario than that. I have this idea for a show called—" "Dear Mr. Donnelly." The producer sighed again. He reached into his pill drawer and took an ulcer capsule. Then he went back to his correspondence. When the man entered his office, he didn't even glance up. "That you, Frick?" he said, eyes on a letter of praise from a Yonkers housewife. When the man didn't answer, the producer looked up. He gasped. "Hey!" he said. "Shut up," the man said harshly. He moved swiftly towards the desk and lifted a bronze ashtray in a lightning motion. He raised the object threateningly over the fat man's head. "Keep quiet," he said. "What is this?" The producer's voice quavered. Then he recognized the face. "You're the one from the show!" The man blinked. His face relaxed, and he lowered the impromptu weapon. I'm sorry." The producer came around the side of the desk. He took the ashtray from his hand and helped him into the interview chair. The man collapsed limply at his touch. "How did you get here?" the producer said. "I don't know," the man mumbled. "I found a door. Back there." He buried his chin on his chest. His clothes were shredded, and his hands were trembling. "Just take it easy," the producer told him. He stabbed his finger on a desk button. The signal brought Frick into the office. "What's up, TD?" Then the assistant saw the man in the chair. "My God," he whispered, swallowing hard. "Gosh, I'm terribly sorry, TD." "Never mind being sorry," the producer said gratingly. "Let's just be thankful he found his way here instead of into the street. If he'd been picked up by the police—" The assistant mopped his brow. "That would have been terrible. They'd surely recognize him from the show. If the FCC saw him in this condition—" "Yes," the producer said grimly. "If they saw him in this condition, the medical office would slap an injunction on us so fast.
we'd all be out in the jam. Do you realize that?"
Frick blanched. "I'll get Dr. Stark in here right away. We'll get him an antidote shot immediately." "That girl," the man said. "It's okay, fella," Frick said. "You're okay now."
"Never mind him," said the producer. "Get Spear in here, right away."
Frick hurried out. The producer poured a slug of brandy into a cup and held it to the man's lips. He gulped it gratefully, and then exploded a rasping cough. When the cough subsided, he buried his head on his chest again, breathing heavily. The producer studied the man's face. It was oddly familiar. "Say," he said. He put his hand under the chin and lifted the face up. The eyes opened. "Aren't you Jerry Spicer?" The man stared blankly. The producer grunted. "Huh. Guess you don't know who you are right now, fella. But you're Jerry Spicer, all right. Imagine that." TD shook his head. "The great Spicer in a thrill show." He chuckled dryly. The doctor bustled into the office, a small cyclone trailing the nervous assistant behind him like a flurrying dust cloud. "Roll up his sleeve," he told the producer commandingly. He removed the hypodermic spray gun from his bag and carefully filled it with a dozen cc's of the antidote. He dabbed the man's arm with a shred of cotton and pressed the spray against his flesh. "Good thing I hung around tonight," the doctor grumbled. "If this man ever got away in this condition—" We know, the producer said testily. "Fix him up and cut the chatter." "I saw that show," the doctor said. "Somebody sure fouled up. Probably gave him an overdose." "We'll get to that later," the producer promised. "Just do your job, Doc." "I'm through," Stark said crisply. "Put him on that couch over there and raise his legs. He'll come to his senses in about 10 minutes. I hope." Frick and the producer helped the man to the sofa. He sprawled on it full length, fingers trailing on the carpet. "Do you know who he is?" TD said. "He's Jerry Spicer." "Who?" "Spicer, the big TV star. You remember." The doctor halted in the process of clasping his bag and came over to the sofa. He looked at the man's relaxed face. "By God," he said, "you're right. Now what the hell is Spicer doing on a thrill show?" The producer shrugged. "I don't know. I haven't heard anything about him for the past 8 or 10 years. "He must have had it tough," Frick said musingly. "I mean, a big star like that on a program like this." "What do you mean, a program like this?" The producer looked displeased. "If the staff had a nickel's worth of imagination, they would have played this up big." "Gosh," said Frick. "That's true. We could have used a credit card." "I bet he wouldn't have permitted it," the doctor said. "You know what Spicer thought of the thrill show." "Yeah?" The producer's face reddened. "Well, we proved how wrong he was, didn't we? The public was just sick and tired of that namby-pamby stuff. There had to be a thrill show." "Sponsors demanded it," Frick said loyally. "And besides," TD added, "if he doesn't like us, what the hell did he sign up for?" The doctor pursed his lips. Maybe he was hungry. Frick said, "He's still not coming round, Doc." "He'd better," Stark said warningly. "If the antidote doesn't work, it could mean a lot of trouble for the thrill show, Mr. Donnelly." The producer looked frightened. "That's ridiculous. It's got to work. It always worked." "You better call your staff," the doctor said. "Find out what dosage they gave this man. Check his FCC medical authorization. And do it fast, Mr. Donnelly. This is just the kind of thing the FCC can hang you on." "Thank God I called that meeting," the producer said. "Here's the straight poop." Manford, the thrill show director, looked briskly around the room. They had gathered around the table in the conference room, the staff members still hollow-cheeked and shaken by their experience in the jam. "This fellow came into the office last week and signed up for a spot in the thrill show. We needed somebody for the Battle of the Sexes show, and he was a pretty nice-looking guy. A little seedy, maybe, but all right. He gave his right name. Here's his record. But nobody on the interviewing staff recognized him. Guess they're all a little too young to remember Jerry Spicer very well. All right, the producer prodded. So what happened? Well, just the routine things. The FCC medical officer gave him the standard physical. His psych check wasn't the best we've ever had, but that's always a debatable business. When he showed up for work yesterday, we gave him the regular dose of 10 cc's of adrenaline and 4 cc's of hypnomechalil. That's SOP for an anger emotion show, of course. The producer looked at Stark. Did you give him the shot? No. The doctor shuffled the papers in his hand. That new fellow, Grayson. Do you want to see him? He's gone home, Manford said. It'll take an hour to get him here. Why not phone screen him? They took the director's suggestion. In a few minutes, the image of Dr. Phil Grayson appeared on phone screen 4. He was a young man, with a high, balding forehead and a rabbity moustache. He looked worried when his home screen brought him the picture of the intense group around the conference table. What is it? He said. Just checking back on some records, Doctor, TD said smoothly. Remember the man you injected today? This fellow Spicer, for the Battle of the Sexes show. The doctor nodded. Of course. Was there anything unusual about the dosage? Grayson looked puzzled. Naturally not. I gave him the prescribed dosage, just like Dr. Stark told me. 10 cc's of noradrenaline, 44 cc's of that, what did you call it? Hypnomechalil. Why? Dr. Stark paled. I told you that, he said. The colour rushed back into his cheeks, a bright crimson. I told you adrenaline, you fool, not noradrenaline, and 4 cc's of hypnomechalil. He looked wildly at the man around the table. I swear I told him, he said. You didn't, the young doctor gasped. You told me 44. Stark jumped to his feet, his face livid. He started towards the phone screen as if to throttle the two-dimensional image on the glass. You're a liar, he cried. You knew it was an anger emotion show. You knew what was required. I didn't know, Grayson answered, his moustache twitching. You didn't tell me that. I just assumed. You assumed! The producer stood up, looking thunderclouds at Dr. Stark. You knew what kind of show it was, Stark. Why didn't you tell him? We needed an anger reaction, not fear. That's what loused up the whole show. Manford groaned. What does that matter now? 44 cc's of hypnomechalil. What kind of a doctor are you, Grayson? Don't you know you could kill a man that way? I didn't know. I never worked with these mechalil drugs. I studied antibiotics. Better if it had killed him, the producer said darkly. We might have covered that up. But we can never get him past the FCC examining officer now. I swear he told me 44. I swear it. Dr. Stark made a rush at the phone screen. Grayson backed away in terror, despite the many miles that were between him and Stark's intended violence. With a snarl, the older doctor reached up and turned off the instrument. Now we're in for it, he told the others. Maybe he'll be all right, Manford said. Maybe he'll snap out of it. A little more antidote. Nonsense, Stark snapped. If it hasn't worked by now, it'll never work. The overdose has permanently affected his nervous system. He's an amnesiac for good. An amnesiac with a permanent case of the jitters. Frick shivered. God, what a fate. The producer looked wise. Yes, he said solemnly. He'd be better off dead, wouldn't he? The staff stared at him. You know what I'm talking about, TD said. He'd be better off dead. Better for him, for the thrill show, for us. Well, Manford said feebly. Well, nothing. The producer's voice was harsh. Do you get the significance of all this? Do you know what happens when the FCC medical officer wants to recheck Spicer? An injunction. A court battle. Then Spicer goes on the stand as Exhibit A, and we lose. No more thrill show. He looked at their faces individually. No more jobs. Bankruptcy. Poverty. The jam. This time, The shiver was collective. "We can't let that happen." Manford licked his lips. "What about the sponsors? They got pulled, don't they? They need us, don't they? I mean, nothing else will give them the kind of ratings they get from the thrill show." "Their hands will be tied," TD said. "One slip is all the federal boys have been waiting for, and with all that foreign criticism our State Department's been getting." "They still buy our films abroad," another staff man said glumly. "That won't matter." The producer sat down heavily and put the cold end of his hook-o-matic in his mouth. "The thrill show is doomed. Let's face it." The group dropped their eyes to the table. "Of course," the producer said quietly, "there's one way out." They looked up at him hopefully. "Remember Juan Esperanzo?" he said. They stared at him. "That was a troublesome situation too, but we came out of that one, didn't we?" They gaped silently. Juan Esperanzo was killed on the Angry City Thrill Show of November 19th, 1985. It was purely an accident, of course. He wandered out of the guide paths in the studio and was struck by a falling prop. Nobody could have foreseen it, and nobody could have prevented it. His family received $50,000 in insurance. The FCC investigation described the incident as unfortunate, and there was a special Juan Esperanzo memorial show held on January 3rd. But these things happen, just as they once did in boxing, football, racing. Nothing unusual, nothing to ban a program about. They turned their eyes to the outer room, where Jerry Spicer lay in a coma on the studio sofa. "Do you get what I mean?" the producer said. "Don't you think we could pass another investigation a la Esperanzo better than we could pass the one we're facing right now?" They looked hopeful and frightened in turn. "You mean deliberately kill him, Dee? Cause an accident? Kill him right on the program?" "Exactly," the producer said with a satisfied smile. "Put him on again tomorrow night. Make it a setup. Have something go wrong. Then keep the cameras trained on him while we rush out of the studio control room to find out if he's all right. The whole country will see it was an accident. Only an accident." He turned to Wilson, the head scriptwriter. "Wilson," he said, "you've got an assignment." He awoke in darkness, trembling with the thought of escape. His hands groped around the floor, trying its solidity. When his fingertips found a wall, he raised himself with agonizing slowness, his nails scraping along the ridges in the damp stone. He pressed his hot cheek against the cool surface and sobbed pitifully. When his eyes adjusted to the feeble light, he measured the strength of his prison and felt the added terror of hopelessness. He turned his eyes to the pool of darkness in the centre of the dungeon and ventured forth a cautious foot. He had taken only 3 steps before he heard the voice. "Look out!" it said. Then he saw the pit. He looked with horror at the writhing beasts inside. He sank to his knees and stared in terrible fascination at their swaying bodies. Then he buried his face in his hands. He looked up when he heard the swish above him. Gleaming, swinging, evoking a memory in an impossibly distant past, it was a pendulum of razor-sharp steel. And it was descending. He screamed and lifted his arms above his head. The pendulum ground to a halt, the mechanism groaning and screeching in protest. There was a second of silence, and then the blade fell to earth with the suddenness of an avenging sword. This time the scream was cut off in his throat, and the giant weapon flattened him sickeningly against the edge of the precipice. Vaguely, as in a dream, he heard the sound of speech and running footsteps, My God, it broke! The pendulum broke! Somebody get the doctor! Look out for that pit! It's a 40-foot drop! Come on! A hand touched his shoulder, and a ring of anxious faces floated like pink balloons over his head. I think he's still alive. What? He can't be. That thing weighs a ton. Well, he looks pretty bad, but I can see his eyes moving, and he seems to be... Get that blade off him! He knew that the great weight had been removed from his body, but he could feel no difference. He was looking with almost objective interest into the face of a fat man, a familiar face with wide eyes and an open, bow-lipped mouth. The face was covered with a film of nervous perspiration, and there was a strange sort of anxiety in the man's movements. "He's got to be! He's got to be!" the fat man was whispering intently. "But T.D., shut up! When you lift him up, I want you to—" He heard nothing more, but his eyes remained open, fixing the face of the fat man. Then he felt arms around his shoulders once more, and he felt himself slipping back towards the edge. With a spurt of strength, with a flash of sudden intelligence, he raised his left arm, and the fingers caught the collar surrounding the fat man's neck in loose folds. He held on grimly until the fat man screamed with satisfying terror. "Look out, T.D.!" somebody shrieked. "He's dragging me with him!" the fat man flailed out helplessly. "He's pulling me over the edge!" Somebody else leaped to his aid, but the dying man's grip was tenacious, his purpose certain. "We're going over!" They did. The fat man and his victim. The cameras 3, 4, and 5 caught the action beautifully. Miss Stitch slipped her compact back into her purse and straightened the corners of the stack of mail on a desk blotter. She looked towards the empty office of the producer and smiled with secretive pleasure. Then she slit open the envelopes in front of her and leisurely read the morning mail. "Dear Mr. Donnelly, boy, oh boy, what a thriller you gave us the other night. I thought Pit and the Pendulum was one of the best thrill shows yet. I sure was disappointed when I saw the title card and thought you were going to rehash that old Poe bit. But that new ending of yours really knocked me cold. I sure got a kick out of seeing that fat old guy going over the edge of the pit. What a terrific wind-up. I wonder if you would be interested in a really great story idea. You see, there's this crazy old guy who has a secret laboratory on a mountaintop. Well, one night it's raining and lightning like mad, and this beautiful blonde comes along in a classy convertible.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Shatter the Wall by Sidney Van Scyoc. Originally published in Galaxy magazine, February 1962. Narrated by Tom Trussel. There he stood, Bass McDowell, life-size on the wall. She made herself look at the hateful, broad-shouldered image with the deliberately penetrating black eyes. She made herself watch his boy image bend over Kippy's slender girl image, made herself listen to his mellow voice gasp, "Kippy, sweet bug." Savagely she thrust upward on the ebony lever. Bass McDowell, wall idle, and Kippy lurched and disappeared. Lights glowed from fixtures recessed into the building, illuminating the long windowless wall room. Catherine, whose hair was a snug dark Kippy cap, leaped from the wall seat. "Don't turn it off now. Couldn't you even tell Mother? He's going to kiss her. Turn it back on this minute." Amanda stationed herself before the lever, shaking her head. "Not until I've spoken to you," she said. "Catherine, I don't think you realize yet what it means, but you're the youngest person, the very youngest living in this city." "Quit calling me that. Everyone has to call me Kippy." She cocked her dark head, Kippy-like. The red mark caused by the constant prodding of her index finger against her cheek glared. "Bass loves Kippy. He called her Sweetie Bug." "I refuse to call you Kippy." She folded her arms. I don't want to discuss your name again, Catherine. It will be Kippy. She squirmed into a Kippy-like position. Soon as I'm 21, I'll change it. You wait. Perhaps you will, Catherine, but I'll never call you Kippy. Oh, quit being silly and turn it on. You might kiss her again. She focused her blue eyes upon the wall. Turn it on. Catherine, I want to talk to you, and I intend to do so without Bass McDowell staring over my shoulder. She sat down beside her daughter. Now, Catherine, you're 19 years old, and you're certainly attractive by any... I don't have dimples like Kippy does. Remembering, she poked her finger back into her cheek. I'm not talking about Kippy. She stared at the finger sunk into her daughter's cheek, wondering how many times she had explained that it wouldn't cause a dimple. I want you to get married, Catherine. I've told you 1,000,000 times I won't. You're always after me, she wailed. Bass won't ever marry anyone, not even Kippy, and she's got dimples. Bass says... Bass McDowell is not a real person. He's only an actor. He's the realest thing in the world, but he won't marry me, so you'd better forget it. She stepped to turn the wall on again. Instantly the ashtray was in Amanda's hand, the massive glass tray Dell had given her. She hurled it at the wall, which shattered with a brittle explosive splintering. Catherine jumped back, wailing, I hate you! Frantically she manipulated the lever and twisted the ebony dials. Bass, come back, Bass! Amanda patted the wall seat. Sit down, Catherine. Finally the girl sat down, sullenly rubbing her eyes with her fists. Catherine, have you noticed that we never see infants on the wall? We never see small children either, because, Catherine, you're the youngest person in this city. The week after you were born, the city hospital's obstetrical ward closed permanently. Catherine sobbed convulsively. Who needs babies? I want Bass. The human race needs babies. Catherine, you sit so complacently in front of your wall and pretend there isn't a world. There won't be unless you wake up. Don't be silly. I'm not. Catherine, you may be the youngest person in the world for all I know. 40 or 50 years from now, this planet will be cluttered with blank walls. There will be no one to watch them. Well, there's nothing I can do about that. I'm not different, like you. Catherine, marry, have children, persuade your friends at the office. She laughed shrilly, rocking back against the wall seat. Friends! They hate me, every one of them, and I hate them. Even if Bass did marry me, they'd only take him away. Amanda clutched her fists. I don't want you to marry Bass. You must find some nice boy your own age. Oh, Mother, you want me to marry some stupid, ugly boy? You can't make me. Catherine, he needn't be dull. There are hundreds of boys, each interesting in... Hearing a sound, she looked up to see Dell, thin and red-headed, standing in the doorway staring at the shattered wall. Catherine jumped up. Mother broke it. She threw that big green ashtray and broke it all to pieces. Dell looked questioningly at Amanda. Honey, why'd you do that? She's jealous of Bass. Now isn't Bass pretty young for you, honey? He stooped to remove the ashtray from inside the shattered wall. Now, how can I watch Alice this evening? She promised me a special dance in that red dress she was showing me last night. Showing you? She sprang up. She showed it to every man in the country, Dell. He frowned. Well, I'll call replacements. I'll have a new wall in before Alice comes. And I'll smash it too. I'll smash every replacement you can buy. Now, Amanda, he regarded her mildly, you're not jealous of Alice? Honey, if you'd watched Lester, you shouldn't care about Alice and me. She took the intact ashtray from him. I'm not jealous of Alice, and I haven't been for 20 years. But, Dell, do you realize Catherine was the last child born in this city? The girl's voice was harsh. She wants me to marry some stupid, ugly boy, and I won't do it. I love Bass. Dell's pale eyes were rebuking. "Amanda, how can you expect Kippy to do that?" She stepped back. "Kippy," she said harshly. "Dell, that girl standing there is Catherine, our daughter, not Kippy." "Don't let such things upset you, baby. I'll go call replacements, and we'll all sit down together when Alice and Lester come." He turned. She seized his arm. "I will not watch Lester," she said. "I will not sit and stare at that big grey-haired ape and pretend I'm in love with him." Dell frowned. "You don't really think he looks like an ape, do you, baby? I was, thinking of changing my name to Lester." Catherine leapt to hug him. "Oh, Daddy, it'll be so wonderful. Lester, Lester, Lester. If we had an Alice and a Bates, it would be almost like a real family." She stared at them. "I'd hoped to put you in a favourable frame of mind for this, Catherine," she said. "You'll remember that 3 years ago the Watsons next door had wall failure and couldn't get service until morning. I invited them to watch our wall." Dell nodded. "Haven't seen them in a while, now that I think of it." "You haven't. But tonight Mrs. Watson is lending me her son Gerald. He's coming at 7. "Mother!" Catherine cried, releasing Dell. "How terrible! Gerald! What a stupid name! I love Bass, and you can't take him away from me." "That wasn't very nice, was it, Amanda?" "It's done," she said. "He's 22, and I want you to talk to him, Catherine." Catherine scowled. "And I've arranged for you to go over to their house to watch Alice if you must, Dell." Dell forgot he was indignant. "Well, Kippy, maybe this one time you can do as your mother wants," he said. "Surely Bass won't mind if you miss him this once. He's an understanding sort of chap." Catherine thought for a moment, scowling. "All right, I'll do it. If you call me Kippy, Mother." Amanda studied her. "All right, Kippy," she said finally. After agreeing reluctantly not to call replacements until Gerald had come and gone, Kippy wriggled into a Kippy-like position and poked a finger deep into her cheek again. Gerald, who arrived promptly at 7, wore his light hair combed into a bass-like curl low over his forehead. He speared Amanda with a penetrating stare, making her shiver as she led him to the wall room. Kippy sulked angrily on the wall seat. Amanda introduced them, and they looked at each other, their glances revealing no interest. "You're trying to comb your hair like Bass," Kippy accused. Gerald grinned. "Sure thing, sweetie bug." "Then you should dye it. It's the wrong colour. Bass doesn't have blonde hair. And why is your name still Gerald? Don't you ever want to be Bass?" Gerald looked slapped. "I tried. Honest, I really did. But you know there's a limit, and the man at the bureau said there was too many Basses already." His face brightened. "But my parents call me Bass all the time." "Oh." Gerald shuffled his feet. Gingerly he sat down. Did you see them last night?" he asked. "Of course. I always see them, except when my mother does something stupid." Quickly Amanda excused herself and went to the food centre. She leaned against the counter, trying to overhear their conversation. They spoke in broken murmurs momentarily, then were silent. Kippy cleared her throat irritably. Nice weather," Gerald said loudly. "I haven't been out." They were silent again. She tried to make her fingers stop picking at a spot on the counter's surface. Suddenly Kippy emerged hurriedly from the wall room, looking put upon. "Where are you going?" Amanda demanded. "He can't talk like Bass, even when he tries, and his hair's the wrong colour, and he has blue eyes." "But, Catherine, Kippy, those are external characteristics. You can't judge a person by the colour of his hair and his eyes. You must get acquainted with him." "I won't do it. I don't love him. I love Bass." She cocked her head, Kippy-like. "And besides, he loves the real Kippy, and I'll never have dimples. I'm going to call replacements." Amanda seized her arm. "Call them, and I'll break the new wall too." I'll break every wall you bring into this house. Don't you understand what's happening? Quit being stupid. I'll break every wall you have installed. And every time you do it, I'll order a new one." She broke loose and ran to the communicator. She had to do something. She wondered briefly, must I do something? It could only be the survival instinct driving her. Perhaps, she thought wryly, she was the only person who still possessed that particular instinct. She could never break every wall in the world, no matter how she tried. She picked up the magazine Kippy had thrown down that morning. Running her finger over the cover, she poked it through Bass's penetrated eye. She poked Kippy in the nose. She flipped the magazine open and went through it, mutilating the pages. "There's a hole in your head, Lester. One less eye for you, Alice. Poor little Kippy, I tore your chin, right through the dimple. Will Bass love you now, Kippy? Goodbye, Bass." She crumpled him into a ball and threw him at the sink. On the next page was a print of a restaurant. She read the caption. "For 2 hours each evening, while film sequences are shown to the home audience, the stars retire to Anatola's for sandwiches, drinks, and shop talk." She tried to stop her thoughts as they went to the sleeping alcove and the old gun in the top shelf of the built-ins. Dell hadn't bothered to unload it since he'd cleaned it last. She dropped the magazine and went to the top shelf of the built-ins. The gun was there. It didn't take her long to drive downtown. There were no other cars on the streets, and the current to the traffic lights had been cut 3 years before. She passed only a prowling squad car, and the 2 police stared at her curiously. She parked a block from Anatola's. Leaving the car, she slung her purse, heavy with the gun, over her arm. Briskly she walked down the deserted street. Anatola, standing behind the bar, was tall, thin, and red-headed. He stared at her incredulously, wiping his hands repeatedly on his long white apron. She went past the bar to a small table. Anatola continued to wipe his hands, as if they would not quite come dry. "You want something?" "Yes. Bring me a bacon and tomato sandwich and milk." "Don't have bacon and tomato." "Kippy. She likes tuna. Base, Hamburg. Lester and Alice, they both take grilled cheese. Which do you want?" "Bring me tuna and milk." "Kippy, she says milk don't go with tuna. Makes a big blob inside." "I said tuna and milk." "Okay, if you want a blob inside. Kippy don't." He ambled away. Not knowing how long she might have to wait, she nibbled at her sandwich. Soon she heard voices approaching the restaurant. She snaked her hand towards the purse, opened it, and clutched the gun. Alice entered first, her hair a disciplined halo of red gold, her eyes vivid green. She was quarrelling with Bass, who cheerfully ignored her, his penetrating eyes staring greedily at the bottles behind the bar. Small, precocious-seeming Kippy followed, her dark hair ruffled by the wind. She stared lovingly up into Lester's eyes. When the door had closed behind them, Amanda stood and raised the gun. They hadn't noticed her. They'd been too anxious to mount the bar stools. Ducks in a shooting gallery, she thought. Alice was sitting nearer her, combing her hair with her fingers. Holding the gun out before her with both hands, Amanda aimed it at Alice's hair. She pulled the trigger. At the sound, they all tried to duck, except Alice, who folded quietly to the floor. Amanda aimed again, and this time Lester crumpled. Ducks in a shooting gallery, she thought. See if you can make that big drake Bass fall off his stool. Bass fell. Kippy screamed, banishing her dimples, and fell beside him. Anatola had disappeared. It didn't matter. She returned the gun to her purse. She hadn't decided what to do next. Suddenly feeling hungry, she sat down to finish her sandwich. When she was through, she rose, slung her purse over her arm again, and stepped past the 4 bodies. They hardly seemed real, lying in their separate pools of crimson. The 2 policemen came in, staring at her again. "Catch her!" Antola cried from beneath the bar. "She done it! She killed them all! Poor little Kippy!" The florid policeman locked his hand about her wrist, while the other cried for Antola to come out. Her wrists were quickly handcuffed, and the florid policeman escorted her to the police car. He shoved her into the back seat. She didn't move, didn't think. The world seemed frozen. It didn't begin to thaw again until the second squad car and the ambulances arrived. They came slowly, without sirens or flashing lights. She wondered why they came so casually. The florid policeman returned to the car. "All dead," he said. "Even poor little Kippy." Silently they drove the deserted streets. She looked out at the buildings, knowing the people inside them soon would be shocked by the news of the Stars' death. When they reached police headquarters, she had to run to keep up with the florid policeman as he pulled her up the stone steps. They walked endless corridors, grey and gloomy, until they emerged into a small, dim room. A man in a tweed coat, who smoked a pipe and spoke suavely, stepped from the group of men in street clothes. "Did you kill them?" he asked. "Don't be afraid to tell me. I only want to know if you killed them." She nodded. "Certainly I did it." He took her purse from the uniformed policeman and removed the gun. "But why? Tell me. Were you jealous of Alice, perhaps?" His pipe jumped as he smiled confidentially. "Certainly not," she said. "I did it to save the human race from suicide." The men smiled, amused. "Lock her up until we decide." The man in tweed instructed the florid policeman. He gave her the purse, minus the gun. A bony, disapproving matron led her to a cell and locked her into it. Amanda requested pencil and paper. The matron frowned, but brought them. Placing the paper against her purse, she began composing a statement to the press, making clear her motives. The filmed sequence still played on the small wall opposite her cell. She glanced up occasionally at the faces and smiled. She had almost completed the statement when the filmed sequence ended. The small, oily MC appeared upon the wall. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. She waited expectantly for the death announcement. "Our stars!" He flung out his arms dramatically. And the 4 stars pranced smiling across the wall. Kippy, Bass, Alice, and Lester. Amanda jumped to the bars. It was not a film. "Matron!" she screamed. "Matron!" Frantically she stared at the 4 actors whom she had murdered and who were alive and smiling. "Matron!" The bony matron unlocked the cell. "Come with me." "Matron, I killed them. I shot them." "Come with me." The matron led her into a small, dim room. The tweedy man smiled confidentially around his pipe. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Davis?" "But I murdered them. You have to keep me here." She tried to catch the lapels of his suit. He smiled again. "Who did you murder, Mrs. Davis?" "All of them. You know I did it. I shot them and they were all dead. He said so, the policeman." Her hands shook. "Look over there." He pointed to a small wall. "They're alive and performing, aren't they, Mrs. Davis?" She looked at the wall. Alice and Lester were planting a small rose bush together. "You see, occasionally women do suffer from delusions like yours," he said. "But now that you're recovered, I'll drive you home. After a quiet night, you'll forget all this." "They aren't delusions," she insisted. "I did it with my husband's gun. I waited until they closed the door, then I aimed. You know I did it." "Yes, certainly," he said, leading her to the door. "Now come along home, Mrs. Davis." She continued to protest, but he pulled her through the corridors and down the steps to a waiting car. He nudged her into the front seat. They passed darkened buildings. She saw the neon sign atop the Herald offices ahead. If no one knew she'd killed them, no one would awaken. No one would live again. The world would end after all. She opened the door and jumped from the moving car. Stumbling, she ran toward the Herald offices. She stumbled into the building and began seeking through its bright corridors, stopping to stare at each office door. She finally found the one labeled Editorial, Mr. Gray. She pushed into the office. The little man behind the desk wore horn-rimmed glasses and smoked a pipe that was a copy of Lester's. He smiled paternally. "Yes, dear?" "I killed them. They're all dead." Realizing excitement did nothing to make her words more believable, she forced herself to be calm. Editor Gray wore his grey hair combed straight back, Lester-like. He stood, putting one hand into his trouser pocket, as Lester always did. "Who did you kill?" he asked quietly. "Calm down, dear. Tell me who you killed." "Lester and all the rest. You have to print it. I shot them. They're dead. Print it in your paper." He crossed the room to his wall. Bass and Kippy were rolling pie dough together, one on either end of the rolling pin. "I'm afraid you're imagining these things, my dear." He sucked his pipe, looked lovingly at Kippy. "I could love that child, but of course Alice would be jealous." She backed away from him into the arms of the Tweedy man who had come into the office. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir," he said. "This poor woman is suffering from delusions. I was driving her home when she escaped me." "That's all right," Editor Gray said mildly. "Perhaps she needs professional help. Have you considered that, my dear?" But Amanda was staring at Bess. She stared at his penetrating eyes, his broad shoulders, at the curl of hair combed low over his forehead. The curl was well left, not right. The Tweedy man took her arm, guided her from building, and nudged her into the car. Do they curl a dead actor's hair differently, she wondered. She had killed them. Why weren't they dead? When they reached her house, it was completely dark. Either Dell and Kippy had gone to bed, or the wall had been replaced and was playing. "I'm sorry I had to bring you away so abruptly," the Tweedy man said. "We can't afford to have the press print unfavourable reports about the force, you understand." He fingered his pipe. "Now, Mrs. Davis, get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow you'll realize it all was a bad dream. You couldn't kill the stars." Woodenly, she walked up the front walk. Hearing Bass's mellow voice from the wall room, she knew Kippy and Dell were up. She entered the room. Kippy sat curled on the wall seat. Amanda stared at the handsome face on the wall. Bass McDowell, ball idol. Why wasn't he dead? His curl was still curled wrong. She looked more closely at his face as he leaned toward Kippy, gasping, "Sweetie bug." There was a small scar beneath his left eye. The tiniest, most insignificant scar, but it had never been there before. "Poor Bass, he looks so tired," the Kippy on the wall seat said. "See how his face looks thinner when he's tired. I wonder if she notices it." Dell said, "After all, Bass has worked hard today, Kippy." Bass's face was indeed thinner. Thinner face, small scar that hadn't been there before, curl that curled wrong. What did it mean? Suddenly she realized the image on the wall wasn't Bass. She corrected herself. He was a different Bass. He wasn't the one she had shot, but his almost identical double. She stared at her daughter, who looked more like Kippy each time she assumed another of her characteristics or poses. There were hundreds of young people wanting to be Bass or Kippy, hundreds of young men combing their hair the way Bass did, smiling as he did, learning to use their eyes as he did. And if the time should come when a new Bass was needed, there he was, hundreds of him. She frowned. Undoubtedly they had several doubles waiting conveniently nearby to perform if something should happen to one of the stars. She felt a choking in her throat. It would be as impossible to kill all the Basses and Kippies as it would be to break every wall in the world. There was no way to get rid of them, no way to make people listen to what was happening, no way to prevent humanity from watching itself to extinction. As they grew older, she guessed, the actors would grow older too. Gradually, Bass would be 30, then 35, and Lester and the others would age too. But no one would notice. Everyone would be aging at the same rate. But someday, someone would notice. Someday all the Lesters would die, and there would be no more Lester to smile at Alice and look thoughtful. And people would look around and see that her daughter, Catherine, was the youngest person in the world. But by then, even Catherine would be past the childbearing age. Stunned, she sat down beside Dell. He squeezed her hand. She looked up at the wall into Bass's penetrating dark eyes. His eyes were so deep, she thought. His hands were strong, and his face was intelligent. How could she ever have hated him? "Where have you been, baby?" Dell asked. She shook her head irritably. "Be quiet," she said. "Can't you see he's going to kiss her?" Perhaps she should change her name to Alice. Then they'd have Kippy, Alice, and Lester. All they needed was a Bass, and they would be almost like a real family. It would be so easy to forget this way, looking deep into Bass's dark eyes.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
Star Bright by Bryce Walton. Originally published in Science Fiction Quarterly, May 1951. Narrated by Tom Trussel. His wife's face was ugly. It was shallow and flat like a broken plate. From the balcony of their apartment in the communal workers' centre, Brooks turned his gaze in his hate away from her face. He looked at the moon. The disk of dreams was being blotted out by the sea. There were night shadows on the sea, fringed with the white curving foam of breaking tide. Like the lost sea of anger beside which he had fought through many sensory show adventures for the rewarding love of Gloria Della, the most beautiful actress of Lunarian Studio City. He moved toward his wife. She backed away until she was standing with her back against the colonnade. Below them the palisades dropped 500 feet into the sea foam. Her voice had an edge to it, a thin, petty whine. "You're sick, Andy. Your face looks funny. You scare me." He stopped. Her grey worker's uniform did nothing for her body. "You're ugly," he said. "I'm leaving. You hate my face, and I hate yours, so I'm getting out." She stared. "Andy, that's against the law. Who ever heard of such a thing?" "You're hearing it now," Andy said. "I can't stand living here with you any more. I can't stand anything about you, or this beehive, so I'm leaving." "But where can you go, Andy?" "They'll find you, Andy. Listen to me. You've been to personology. They've examined you. You had that bad accident at the takeoff port. You made a mistake installing that fuel capsule, and there was an explosion. Men were killed. What did they say at personology?" Brooks stared at the soft-calling moon. "Gloria Della was there tonight," he whispered. "I wonder if she's as tired of being just an actress for my dreams as I am of just dreaming of her." "Andy, what did they say at personology?" "Oh, a lot of stuff I didn't understand." What it amounts to is that I'm crazy. Crazy? Schizophrenia, Andy said. Fantasy and reality mixed up. That's what the personologist chief said. He said that always leads to inefficiency. Remember the axiom, Brooks, he said. No worker makes mistakes. That's right, Andy. There's a place for dreaming, and there's a time for working. You kept on thinking about that Gloria Della, even after you got out of the sensory shows. You carried pictures of her, always rereading those silly letters she sent you after you wrote that nonsense love note. Your room is filled with pin-ups of her, so you went and had an accident. See, that proves the personologist was right. You made a mistake. Men were killed. Brooks looked at the moon. 240,000 miles away, he mused. His paradise. Ha, his wife said. She wouldn't use you for a doormat. You're just part of another dream she has to act in, that's all. Why, you little runt, she wouldn't give you a second look, not even a first look. You're a fool, even if you aren't crazy. Brooks scarcely heard his wife's shrill voice. He had constructed a dream world of his own named Angar. On this world, he and the great actress had lived through 1,000 glorious adventures. Comparing his wife with Gloria Della made the situation impossible. It was the same with his wife, he knew. She had his sensory show hero, Clifford Marlowe, with whom no mortal, least of all Andy Brooks, could ever compare. All right, he had the answer to both of their problems. He was getting out, tonight. He closed his eyes a moment. There was Gloria Della, walking beside the lost sea of Angar. Come back, my dear. The armies of Vaska are at the palace gates. Now pray for your return and the strength of your arms and your love. Andy, look at me. I'm tired of looking at you, Andy said and opened his eyes. And anyway, I have to run away. They're going to give me directed sensory shows. They're going to select all my entertainment for me, drive all my own dreams out, drive Gloria Della out, and replace my free choice entertainment with their own. He called it directive therapy. It will cure me, make me an efficient worker again, but it'll mean I won't love Gloria Della anymore. Fool, she cried. It's crazy to love our actors and actresses outside the sensory shows. That's what he told me, Andy said. He said that the sensory shows were planned and provided for the workers by personology, just to keep us sane and efficient. Our actors and actresses are for everyone's benefit, he said. He said it was antisocial for me to want to monopolize Gloria Della for myself. That's right, Andy, that's right. Oh, he was a great talker, the personologist was. He said personology had saved the world from destruction. Once everyone was crazy, he said, running around in a daze, with fantasy and reality all mixed up. Made wars and criminals and neurotics, he said. Now we've got planned, legalized fantasy in the sensory shows. A man can be a big shot on an imaginary world. He can have the support of the most beautiful actresses and actors. Now there's a definite time for dreaming, one for working. Normally, one never overlaps the other. That's absolutely right, Andy. You should see that. I do. You're a shallow idiot, Andy said. You're content to dream. I'm not. I'm interested in the real Gloria Della. The dreams aren't enough anymore, not for me. Andy, you're always different. I could never figure you out, and I'm not interested in trying. But all I've got to say is you're just not using common sense. What if all us workers who worship the actors and actresses up on Hollywood 2 stormed the moon? Took 1,000,000 rockets and all flew to the moon? You're crazy, Andy, and think how wonderful the sensory shows are. Work a few hours a week, and the rest of the time you can live a beautiful life with actors and actresses who are so good they can make you believe anything. Not me, Andy said. If a dream can't come true, it's no good. So I'm going to the moon, to Studio City, and I'm going to find Gloria Della in person. Her dull eyes bulged incredulously at him. Andy, that's forbidden. You'll be breaking a Class A law, and you know what happens with them that does that. I'm going, Andy said. I can sneak aboard a moon rocket. I'm going tonight." "Andy, I'll tell. I'll not let you do it." Andy lunged. Her cries gurgled into silence under his fingers. He lifted her shivering body up over the colonnade. "I figured you would," he said, "and then I figured that this way you wouldn't." Her body fell into the darkness. Brooks stood there a long time, gazing down at the curling white foam of the breakers. It was like ripping open a black hole and pouring the past into it. He closed up the hole and turned. He could never have submitted to directed sensory shows, so he had to fight. In the old days, a man could fight for what he loved, even if success was impossible. It was pursuit that counted, the pursuit of happiness that made men and nations strong, when there had been men and nations. And his heart beat wildly as he went down the escalator. He might not succeed, but he would have the pleasure of trying the forbidden and incredible. He would crash the gates of Studio City on the moon. The pilot was forward in the cage checking the pre-navigation controls. Brooks slipped into the freight chamber and crawled behind newly loaded packing cases. His skin tingled and his breathing was rapid. His audacity had been the big factor in his successfully sneaking aboard the new moon supply rocket. It was inconceivable that anyone would so much as think of breaking a Class A law. The punishment was extreme. Only a few select personnel, other than the stars, including producers and directors and psychogenic radial screen projection artists and the like, ever made the flight, and for them it was always a one-way trip. Only the pilot and the security guard accompanying the flight ever returned from the moon, and they never left the rocket while on the moon. The rocket always returned immediately to Earth. A veil of glamorous mystery surrounded the stars and the fabulous Studio City. Brooks' familiarity with the takeoff field, where he had worked as a mechanic and fuel man until his negligence had caused the big blow-up, his knowledge of its arrangement and schedule, had enabled him to don a mechanic's uniform in the locker room, get an electro drill from the supply house for use as an excuse for boarding the rocket. Boarding, he went unnoticed. Mild confusion always reigned about the rocket prior to takeoff. No one had noticed that he had not come out of the rocket. And luckily for him, Personology had removed all personnel who had been employed at the field at the time of the disaster for therapy. Personology always looked out for the workers. So Brooks lay in darkness, shivering with excitement that was partly fear. The muffled, thunderous explosion engulfed him. The area around him vibrated smoothly. The rocket was lifting. Even protected as he was by the inflated shock cushion Andy had dug out of a freight room storage locker, the pressure was intense. He blacked out, and he knew he had been out a long time when his own groaning awakened him. He grabbed at the edge of a packing case to pull himself erect. The effort smashed him up into the ceiling. Blood ran down his face. He was weightless now, in space. He moved around a little, careful to hold on to something. Then Andy stared at the dim shadow of the bulkhead door. He licked his lips slowly. The throbbing of his pulse became thunderous. The emptiness in his stomach turned to nausea. This was real adventure, not a dream. But it would have to end somewhere, sometime. He rubbed his lips, and sweat ran down his face. What then? A Class A law said no one was to go to the moon. But why was it so important? What was so wrong about actually seeing the actors and actresses, about seeing the big production factories where they acted out one's dreams? His flesh seemed cold and feverish at once. The penalty made him wince. Condemnation to the experimental stations, a fate normally reserved for hereditary and incurable mental defectives. Experiments involving spaceflight, which so far no human body had been able to sustain beyond a few million miles. Brain surgery, body structural alterations. There were other experiments not commonly discussed. No one looked forward to breaking a Class A law. No one survived the experiments. It was capital punishment that benefited the order, and therefore it was good. but not for Andy Brooks. Yet there was no turning back now. Murder was also an infringement of Class A law, but that might be considered an accident. Anyone could fall from a balcony or jump. Andy thought briefly of his wife, very briefly. She was dead. It didn't seem very important whether she was dead or not. She had stood in his way. That had been important. There had never been anything between them anyway, but a silent, bitter, futile hatred for each other's unattractiveness. She loved Clifford Marlowe, the great actor. He loved Gloria Dellar, the actress. No mortal could compare with either of them. No one felt any emotional regard for anyone else. Emotion was confined to the sensory shows. A time for emotion and dreaming and wish fulfillment. A time for working. The two never got mixed up. That's what personology had told him. Brooks was trying to figure out what he would do when the rocket hit the moon, when it dropped into the depths of Theophilus' 18,000-foot, 65-mile-wide crater and into the City of Stars. He was concentrating on that when the bulkhead door began to open. Brooks gnawed at his lips as he crouched behind the door. The security guard entered, checking probably for possible weight shift. Holstered to the belt of his grey uniform was a neurotube and a Meson blast gun. The continuing Cold War with the Eastern Alliance necessitated constant preparedness against possible espionage. That's what personology said. As the guard turned to exit, he saw Brooks. His eyes widened remarkably. His hands moved out as though questioning Brooks' reality. Without thinking, Brooks leaped, his breath breaking harshly. The guard grabbed wildly at Brooks's wrist, and they fell back, scrambling and grunting. The fall broke the guard's hold. Brooks slammed the drill against the guard's chest and squeezed the trigger release. The gentle whir of the drill was drowned by the guard's short, incredulous scream of pain. Blood spilled over the drill and ran down Brooks's arm as the guard rolled lifelessly against the wall, trembled slightly with the dropping, decelerating motion of the rocket. Brooks leaned against the wall. The silence was vast. He looked at his fingers as he sensed the rocket settling. It was done. Really done now. He could not change it back. His wife's body falling into the blackness had seemed a kind of unreal thing, but this was horribly real. The guard would never worry any more about dreams, or about reality either. Maybe he was luckier than most, maybe luckier than Andy Brooks, the mechanic who had stopped machinery no mechanic could repair. This was murder, for which Andy would pay. But that didn't matter. He had broken a Class A law when he boarded the moon rocket. There were no degrees of guilt. The thought gave him a kind of freedom inside, a sudden snapping of strings and singing of breaking wires. He took the neurotube from the guard. It did things to the nervous system, including paralysis and blackout. Its sustained use could cause death. He didn't take the Meson blast gun. It was too lethal, and he was afraid of it. He slipped along the grill mesh corridor and crouched outside the door into the pilot's cage. He stared at the pilot's back, past the pilot into the view screen. The moon was as big as Earth below, sharp angles of light and shadow, gigantic craters and pools of glaring frozen lava. The purple-black shadows of Theophilus walls dropped around the rocket. Far below, like a dot of glittering ice, was the white-domed brilliance of Studio City. Brooks stared in awed wonderment. Maybe this was a dream too. It was too fabulous to be real. A worker on the moon. A worker actually being a part of Hollywood 2's legendary marvels. He could see the big production factories where the stars acted out a man's dreams, where the big psychogenic radial projection screens performed their miraculous function. On Earth, the millions of ardent fans spent all possible time in the sensory shows. A small dark chamber, a beam of light, A whiff of gas, music. You didn't look at it. You were in it. Your wishes took form. Actors and actresses of your choice supported you. It was touch, taste, action, emotion. It was so real that no worker cared to dream during working hours. In the sensory show chamber, he could be anything, on any one of many possible worlds. He could be a beggar, a king, a soldier, or a god. And Gloradella was your wife, mistress, lover. But there was a real Gloradella, too. A blare of cushioning brilliance spilled over the view screen. The rocket disappeared in a wall of flame. The dome opened. Tractor beams clutched the rocket, tilted it, dropped it gently. The pre-navigated controls combined with receiving facilities to work out the usual mechanized and perfect routines. The pilot seemed bored. A dolt, Brooks thought, a man regularly making this flight, unmoved by the grandeur and wonderment. As the rocket was gripped in the big robotractor arms and placed atop a tubular gas duct preparatory to the return takeoff, Brooks caught a brief glimpse of the city of stars. Just like the ads, the many publicity shots of background for the stars, at home, at work, at play. Wide avenues between smoothly domed buildings leading off into parks, residential areas. The grass, the trees, the flowers were strange, unlike anything on Earth. Brooks jerked open the door, pressed the neurotube against the pilot's neck. The pilot turned slowly. His face was unimaginative, white, and twisted with shocked surprise. He stared wide-eyed at Brooks. "What?" the pilot whispered. "Shut up," Brooks warned. "I'm going out there. I want to see. Open the side port doors." The pilot's eyes looked beyond Brooks. "The guard's dead," Brooks said. "I killed him with an electrode drill. I can keep this neurogun on you until you die too. Open the doors. Don't try to stop me from going out there." The pilot choked. "I'll not try to stop you. Go ahead. Why should I try to stop you?" "You'd better not try to stop me," Brooks said. "Let me tell you something. Listen, the sensory shows are no good. They create an illusion of happiness for us, like dope. Anything that makes an illusion of happiness with no basis in reality, that's wrong. It's the same threat to a man's mind that learning to stop being hungry without eating would be to your body. Isn't that right?" The pilot's mouth hung wordlessly open. "I'll tell you what's wrong." Brooks's voice was loud. "A dream has to be possible to find in reality, or it's no good. That's where personology's wrong. Dreams are no good if they can't come true. What good are wishes and hopes and ambitions if you can't find them except in a sensory show? Answer me that." The pilot said. "I'll answer it," Brooks shouted. "They're no good at all. They're bad. It won't last. People will revolt, or they'll rot sooner or later. Maybe I'm the first and there'll be no more. Maybe I'm the last and everybody'll rot. I'm in love with the Gloradella, see? Really in love. You understand that? Listen, you stupid dolt. Don't tell me she's your favourite actress too. It doesn't mean anything. You don't have the nerve to do anything about it. The question is, can she ever be in love with me? A worker." I don't know," whispered the pilot. "You know what the personologist said to me," Brooks screamed. "He told me we'd all be crazy without the sensory shows. When you mix dreams up with reality, he said, that's insanity. What's more insane than admitting that the work we do is all we'll ever get out of life? We can never know anything wonderful, anything we really want in real life. Can you tell me what would be more insane than that?" The pilot shook his head. Sweat ran down his nose. "Don't move, or I'll leave the neurotube on you long enough to kill you," Brooks shouted, "because you don't understand." "I won't move," the pilot whispered. "I won't try to stop you. I won't say anything. Go back out there and I'll open the door for you. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know anything. I've never seen you." "All right, you're a fool, but I think you're honest." Already the side freight chamber port was open. Robotractors were unloading and carting the freight onto conveyor belts. Brooks ran into the exit chamber, shut the air tight. The pilot kept his word. The outer door opened. Brooks went down the ladder. He ran. He didn't look back. He didn't have time for that. Somewhere there were a few guards stationed here permanently in an isolated barracks building. They would learn of his deeds. But he was free for a while. He ran down the long silent avenues and through the strangely silent parks, among the odd unearthly plants and among the alien-looking trees and over the paper-like, unreal-seeming grass. Above him, the Teflonite dome that held in the synthetic atmosphere was like a huge white bubble. Brooks walked like a drugged man through his dreams come true. He stared, his mouth hung open. A warm, ecstatic joy filled him. Stars, stars everywhere! There was Ellen Morland and Clifford Marlowe gliding past in a bubble-shaped shiny white grav car. They passed so close to Brooks he could see the colour of their eyes, the shine of their teeth. To most women, Clifford Marlowe was the fulfillment of every wish. Ellen Morland was second only in popularity to Gloria Della. Beautiful people, golden-skinned, perfectly proportioned, like gods and goddesses. Brooks walked slowly, haltingly, taking in the atmosphere like a thing starved. It was beautiful here, but there was something wrong with the air. It was the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was too heavy, and he couldn't explain it. There was something of fear in the silence. Nothing moved except the stars moving across the wide green lawns of paper-like grass, the stars whirring along the streets or through the air noiselessly. The stars that made no sound. There should be noise somewhere. There, walking toward him, 4 of Hollywood 2's most demanded supporting players. They were walking right past him. He could touch them. Michael Torrenson, Mara Rosara, Greta Moore, Gil Grendon. They brushed against him as they passed. Brooks stumbled out of their way. He could talk to these people if he could work up the courage. Maybe later he would have the courage, after the initial days had worn a little, when he found Gloria Della. But why hadn't they noticed him? They didn't seem to see him, even though he was there. They would have bumped into him if he hadn't stepped aside. Now Andy felt lost, terribly small, all at once terribly alone as he wandered up and down the glamour-shrouded avenues, through the parks, the wonderfully intricate playgrounds for the stars' children. Special, beautiful little creatures playing with wonderfully advanced toys. They would grow up to provide dreams for the sensory show millions. But now they didn't make any noise. That was odd. Kids usually shouted and laughed when they played. But then Stars' children would be different. Here everything had a strange, silent difference. Andy hadn't expected quite this much difference. The silence was smothering, suffocating. Stars, stars everywhere. The living, breathing embodiments of millions of workers' millions of dreams. But no sounds. He saw no one else of his own class, though that wasn't surprising. No workers, no guards, no one in the grey utilitarian uniforms, just stars in their beautifully unique, individually styled garments. Just the silent children playing silently, like figures moving in an old three-dimensional movie. Dorothy Dillon walked past, tall and lithe and the colour of melting copper, her hair a tingling black cloud around bare shoulders. Andy could have touched her arm. He started to say something, but he couldn't. She didn't seem to see him. He clenched his hands and started to yell something after her, but managed to control himself. Bitterness and resentment crowded the awed wonderment. Maybe that was the reason personology strictly forbade anyone coming to the moon. It would break illusions. Maybe the stars were really just a lot of superior snobs who held their worshippers in contempt. Maybe. But Gloria Della wouldn't be like that. She was different. he knew. Together they had shared dream adventures that were his and his alone. Angar, the palace of Angar, the armies of Vaska. She would be different. A sense of timelessness carried him along. There was no day or night by contrast. It was always synthetic day. The bubble overhead, the smooth domed buildings, the walkways and avenues, all radiated a cold, ever-shining light. He hadn't taken the guard's watch. How long had he been walking? He didn't feel hungry or thirsty or tired. There was no measurement in silence, in cold, white, unchanging light. He stood by a lake. The scene was like a three-dimensional photograph, the grass under him like rustling confetti. The big lake's surface was like smooth shining glass. Swans glided along the glass like clockwork. Huge water lilies trembled with a strange regularity of motion in a slight breeze that was always the same. Then he saw her, Glora Della, walking along the shore, only a few feet away. A sudden weakness overcame him. His knees gave way and he dropped on a bench. He half rose, sank down. "Glora," he whispered, "Glora." She wasn't alone. A man walked with her, the favourite of millions of women who for some reason found Clifford Marlowe not quite perfect. Carl Brittain. In the People's Fan magazine there had been hints that Glora Della and Carl Brittain were more than just friends. Brooks had figured it as being more propaganda. Jealousy and hate roiled to muddy fear and self-inadequacy, and Brooks shrank down against the bench, hoping they wouldn't see him. He wanted to crawl into a dark corner, hide somewhere. There was no dark corner. Everything was bright and white and blazing white light. Here no man could hide. No man could sleep where there was no night. A sharp, shrill whistle dug into his brain. He jerked around. Far across the expanse of park, a black sky car came whirring, gliding, sliding toward him. The ultrasonic whistle sharpened painfully, and he knew this was pursuit. The pilot hadn't been so honest, maybe, but that made no difference now. It had never been anything, anyway, that would have gone on forever. No matter when the black sky car came for him, there would never have been a place to hide. It didn't matter now, not after seeing Glora Della and Brittain together like this. But before the guards picked him up. He ran toward the lake. The sky car was an elongated shadow over the glassy water, over the glossy mechanically moving leaves of the huge water lilies, over the backs of the clockwork swans. The whistle seemed to split his skull. "Glora!" he shouted. He ran toward them. Evidently they didn't hear him. She didn't turn. Brittain didn't turn. Brooks's shout faded across the lake into the glowing bubble and died. He grabbed her arm and spun her around. Carl Brittain walked on, and Brooks stared into Glora Della's eyes. A cold shiver went down his neck. What was the matter? Where was the warmth, the love, the passion, the worship, the dark, deep longing? There was no recognition, and without that there could never be any of the other things. However the big psychogenic radial projection screens functioned, the actors and actresses probably were never aware of the individuals they entertained. They entertained all the workers. All the workers. "Glora, look at me. I wrote the letters, thousands of fan letters. You answered them. They were addressed to me, personally, me, Andy Brooks." She said slowly, "Andy Brooks?" 50 feet away the sky car settled. Swans glided silently across the lake of glass without noticing anything. Water lilies moved in the unchanging breeze. Glora Della's eyes were on a level with his. "Don't you know me?" Brooks shouted wildly. "You've got to! Andy Brooks!" She repeated his names. "Yes, yes," Brooks screamed. "Look at me, Andy Brooks. Remember the lost world of Angar? Why dream of each other? Why should we fool ourselves with dreams? I'm here now. I'm real. You're real. I've broken a Class A law triply to come here to you. Glora, you've got to see me. Talk to me. Angar. Listen to me, Glora. The world of Angar. The armies of Vaska. Our dream. I was holding the castle. Vaska's fleets were laying siege. I was guarding the seawall. How could it have gone on so long without you knowing? It was our dream. Vaska. Sobbing frantically, Brooks turned. 2 guards were leaping from their sky car. One of them was shouting, "You there, halt! With orders to kill you if you resist!" "Get back!" Brooks cried. "Stay right there!" He lifted the neurogun. Now he wished he'd brought the blast gun. He'd have blown these guards and their sky car in a million pieces. The guards came slowly toward him along the lake's edge. The swans glided unconcerned. Brooks screamed defiantly. As he fired at one guard, he threw himself to one side. The foremost guard fell in silent paralysis. Evidently, reflex action caused him to accidentally discharge the Meson blast gun. A blazing lethal flame mushroomed, and the green lawn crackled to black char in a long smoking swath. Brooks fired again. The other guard dodged behind an alien-looking tree with orange leaves. Brooks ran wildly. "Glora, wait!" She turned as Brooks ran past her. Her shoulder struck Carl Brittain, and the actor's body toppled into the lake. He went under without a struggle. The water opened and slid over his body again like thick, shiny glue. The swans glided over the spot. Brittain didn't come up. There was no movement in the water. Brooks ran on after Glora, who hadn't stopped walking. Behind him, he heard the guard shouting. He ran past a parked sky car. Beside it, a couple sat shoulder to shoulder looking over the lake. They seemed oblivious to the commotion. Brooks grabbed Glora's arm and dragged her toward the sky car. "You'll remember," he sobbed. "I'll see that you remember." He slid the cowling back. As he started to drag the woman into the seat, he hesitated. He stared into her face. The face he had kissed many times in 1,000 adventure dreams in 100 imagined worlds. It was the same, but somehow different. Her eyes returned his stare, unblinking, unrecognizing, unconcerned. Her flesh was strangely unresponsive to his hands. No resistance, no compliance, nothing at all. The guard was running, and he was near. He stopped, levelled the Meson blast gun. "I don't want to kill you," he shouted hysterically. "Give yourself up. I've never killed anything, and I don't want to kill you." Brooks laughed crazily. "You'll kill her too if you fire at me. You'll kill the dreams of millions of your fellow workers if you kill Glora Delar. Get back there now." "You're too dangerous," the guard said. "I've orders to kill you if you don't give yourself up, because you're insane." Andy Brooks laughed. He tried to push Glora Delar into the sky car. He saw the guards was going to risk a blast. He spun, dropped her body between them. It had flashed through his mind. If she died with him, then in a way she would be his forever, only his, and she would never be shared with all the other millions of workers. A blazing light burned and blinded him. He fell gasping and crumbling with a deep and lasting agony. He lay in burning fog. He tried to get up. He couldn't move. Through a thickening blur he saw the guard lurching toward him, his face white and contorted with horror. Brooks's hand fumbled blindly, touching something. "Glora," he whispered. He slowly twisted his head. He had to do that much. The sky car was a smoking, melting pile, unrecognizable. Beside him lay something else, also smoking, a human outline, a framework of wire and metallic joints, bits of cloth and melting fluid, springs, some burned-out vacuum tubes, a condenser, a charred coil, other parts, all running down through a framework, a skeleton of red-hot wire. Charred hair sizzled in blue flame in the fine mesh of a metal skull. Glora Delar. The guard stood over Brooks, his face twisted. His voice came through a dense curtain of time and space and pain. Been here for years, but I never suspected such a thing. I knew something was queer, but this is what they give us. Puppets, marionettes, wire and putty and plastic. She was my favourite actress too, my pin-up girl, just a second ago. Ha ha ha! Funny, isn't it? I fought for her 1,000 times in the lost world of Angar against the armies of Vaska, and this is what they give us for dreams. Brooks managed to turn his head so he wouldn't have to look at what lay beside him. The two pretending lovers still sat shoulder to shoulder by the lake, beautiful golden people staring over the water, romantic lovers. They were oblivious to what had happened. The lake was coloured glass, unruffled. The clockwork swans glided over the shiny surface. The perfumed wind blew unchanged through dutifully nodding leaves of the water lilies. Above him, the great bubble of a studio city seemed to burst in a million bright glittering shards. "I'll tell everybody," the guard was shouting. "I'll tell all the millions so they'll know." And there was no sound but the wild fading cries of the guard as Brooks closed his eyes to sleep. And this is one dream, he thought, that will be my own, my own.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
The Walls by Keith Laumer, originally published in Amazing Stories, March 1963. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Harry Trimble looked pleased when he stepped into the apartment. The lift door had hardly clacked shut behind him on the peering commuter faces in the car before he had slipped his arm behind Flora's back, bumped his face against her cheek, and chuckled. "Well, what would you say to a little surprise? Something you've waited a long time for." Flora looked up from the dialer ration panel. "A surprise, Harry?" "I know how you feel about the apartment, Flora. Well, from now on, you won't be seeing so much of it." "Harry!" He winced at her clutch on his arm. Her face was pale under the day-glare strip. "We're not moving to the country?" Harry pried his arm free. "The country? What the devil are you talking about?" He was frowning now, the pleased look gone. "You should use the lamps more," he said. "You look sick." He glanced around the apartment. The 4 perfectly flat rectangular walls, the glassy surface of the vari-glow ceiling, the floor with its pattern of sink-away panels. His eye fell on the 4-foot square of the TV screen. "I'm having that thing taken out tomorrow," he said. The pleased look was coming back. He cocked an eye at Flora. "And I'm having a full wall installed." Flora glanced at the blank screen. "A full wall, Harry?" "Yep." Harry smacked a fist into her palm, taking a turn up and down the room. "We'll be the first in our cell block to have a full wall." "Why, that will be nice, Harry." "Nice?" Harry punched the screen control, then deployed the 2 chairs with tray racks ready to receive the evening meal. Behind him, figures jiggled on the screen. "It's a darn sight more than nice," he said, raising his voice over the shrill and thump of the music. "It's expensive, for one thing. Who else do you know that can afford?" But nothing. Imagine it, Flora. It'll be like having a balcony seat, looking out on other people's lives." "But we have so little space now. Won't it take up?" "Of course not. How do you manage to stay so ignorant of technical progress? It's only 1/8 of an inch thick. Think of it. That thick." Harry indicated 1/8 of an inch with his fingers. "And better colour and detail than you've ever seen. It's all done with what they call an edge excitation effect." "Harry, the old screen is good enough. Couldn't we use the money for a trip?" How do you know if it's good enough? You never have it on. I have to turn it on myself when I get home." Flora brought the trays, and they ate silently, watching the screen. After dinner, Flora disposed of the trays, retracted the table and chairs, and extended the beds. They lay in the dark, not talking. "It's a whole new system," Harry said suddenly. "The full-wall people have their own programming scheme. They plan your whole day, wake you up at the right time with some lively music, give you breakfast menus to dial, then follow up with a good sitcom to get you into the day. Then there's nap music, with subliminal hypnotics if you have trouble sleeping. Then—" "Harry, can I turn it off if I want to?" "Turn it off?" Harry sounded puzzled. "The idea is to leave it on. That's why I'm having it installed for you, you know, so you can use it." "But sometimes I'd like to just think." "Think? Brood, you mean?" He heaved a sigh. "Look, Flora, I know this place isn't fancy. Sure, you get a little tired of being here all the time, but there are plenty of people worse off. And now, with full wall, you'll get a feeling of more space." "Harry," Flora spoke rapidly, "I wish we could go away. I mean, leave the city and get a little place where we can be alone, even if it means working hard, and where I can have a garden and maybe keep chickens, and you could chop firewood." "Good God!" Harry roared, cutting her off. Then, "These fantasies of yours," he said quietly. "You have to learn to live in the real world, Flora. Live in the woods. Wet leaves, wet bark, bugs, mould. Talk about depressing." There was a long silence. "I know. You're right, Harry," Flora said. "I'll enjoy the full wall. It was very sweet of you to think of getting it for me." "Sure," Harry said. "It'll be better. You'll see." The full wall was different, Flora agreed as soon as the serviceman had made the last adjustments and flipped it on. There was vivid colour, fine detail, and a remarkable sense of depth. The shows were about the same, fast-paced, bursting with variety and energy. It was exciting at first, having full-sized people talking, eating, fighting, taking baths, making love, right in the room with you. If you sat across the room and half closed your eyes, you could almost imagine you were watching real people. Of course, real people wouldn't carry on like that. But then it was hard to say what real people might do. Flora had always thought Doll Star wore padded brasseries, but when she stripped on full wall, there wasn't any fakery about it. Harry was pleased too when he arrived home to find the wall on. He and Flora would dial dinner with one eye on the screen, then slip into bed and view until the bulldoze pills they'd started taking took effect. Perhaps things were better, Flora thought hopefully. More like they used to be. But after a month or two, the full wall began to pall. The same faces, the same pratfalls, the same happy quizmasters, the puzzled prize winners, the delinquent youths and fumbling dads, the bosoms, all the same. On the 63rd day, Flora switched the full wall off. The light and sound died, leaving a faint, dwindling glow. She eyed the glassy wall uneasily, as one might view the coffin of an acquaintance. It was quiet in the apartment. Flora fussed with the dialer ration, averting her eyes from the dead screen. She turned to deploy the solitaire table, and started violently. The screen, the residual glow having faded now, was a perfect mirror. She went close to it, touched the hard surface with a finger. It was almost invisible. She studied her reflected face, the large dark eyes with shadows under them, the cheek line, a trifle too hollow now to be really chic, the hair drawn back in an uninspired bun. Behind her, the doubled room, unadorned now that all the furnishings were retracted into the floor except for the pictures on the wall. Photographs of the children away at school, a sunny scene of green pastureland, a painting of rolling waves at sea. She stepped back, considering the effect. The floor and walls seemed to continue without interruption, except for a hardly noticeable line. It was as though the apartment were twice as large, if only it weren't so empty. Flora deployed the table and chairs, dialed a lunch, and sat, eating, watching her double. No wonder Harry seemed indifferent lately, she thought, noting the rounded shoulders, the insignificant bust, the slack posture. She would have to do something in the way of self-improvement. Half an hour of the silent companionship of her image was enough. Flora snapped the screen back on, watched almost with relief as a grinning cowboy in velvet chaps made strumming motions while an intricately fingered guitar melody blared from the soundtrack. Thereafter, she turned the screen off every day, at first only for an hour, later for longer and longer periods. Once she found herself chatting gaily to her reflection, and hastily fell silent. It wasn't as though she were becoming neurotic, she assured herself. It was just the feeling of roominess that made her like the mirror screen. And she was always careful to have it on when Harry arrived home. It was about 6 months after the full wall had been installed that Harry emerged one day from the lift, smiling in a way that reminded Flora of that earlier evening. He dropped his briefcase into his floor locker, looked around the apartment, humming to himself. "What is it, Harry?" Flora asked. Harry glanced at her. "It's not a log cabin in the woods," he said, "but maybe you'll like it anyway." "What is it, dear?" "Don't sound so dubious." He broke into a broad smile. "I'm getting you another full wall." Flora looked puzzled. "But this one is working perfectly, Harry." "Of course it is," he snapped. "I mean you're getting another wall. You'll have 2. What about that? 2 full walls, and nobody else in the cell block has 1 yet. The only question is," he rubbed his hands together, striding up and down the room, eyeing the walls, "which wall is it to be? You can have it adjacent or opposite. I went over the whole thing with the full wall people today. By God, they're doing a magnificent job of programming. You see, the 2 walls will be synchronized. You're getting the same show on both. You're seeing it from 2 angles, just as though you were right there in the middle of it. The whole program has been built on that principle." "Harry, I'm not sure I want another wall." "Oh, nonsense! What is this, some kind of self-denial urge? Why not have the best, if you can afford it? And by God, I can afford it. I'm hitting my stride." "Harry, could I go with you some day? Tomorrow? I'd like to see where you work, meet your friends." "Flora, are you out of your mind? You've seen the commuter car. You know how crowded it is. And what will you do when you got there? Just stand around all day, blocking the aisle? Why don't you appreciate the luxury of having your own place, a little privacy, and now 2 full walls?" "Then could I go somewhere else I could take a later car? I want to get out in the open air, Harry. I haven't seen the sky for years, it seems." "But," Harry groped for words, staring at Flora, "why would you want to go up on the roof?" "Not the roof. I want to get out of the city, just for a little while. I'll be back home in time to dial your dinner." "Do you mean to tell me you want to spend all that money to wedge yourself in a verticar and then transfer to across town and travel maybe 70 miles, packed in like a sardine, standing up all the way, just so you can get out and stand in a wasteland and look back at the walls? And then get back in another car, if you're lucky, and come back again?" "No, I don't know. I just want to get out, Harry. The roof. Could I get to the roof?" Harry came over to pat Flora awkwardly on the arm. "Now, take it easy, Flora. You're a little tired and stale, I know. I get the same way sometimes, but don't get the idea that you're missing anything by not having to get into that rat race. Heaven knows I wish I could stay home, and this new wall is going to make things different. You'll see."
The new full wall was installed adjacent to the first, with a joint so beautifully fitted that only the finest line marked the junction. As soon as she was alone with it, Flora switched it off. Now 2 reflections stared back at her from behind what appeared to be 2 intersecting planes of clear glass. She waved an arm. The 2 slave figures aped her. She walked toward the mirrored corner. They advanced. She stepped back. They retreated. She went to the far corner of the room and studied the effect. It wasn't as nice as before. Instead of a simple room, neatly bounded on all 4 sides by solid walls, she seemed now to occupy a stage set off by windows through which other similar stages were visible, endlessly repeated. The old feeling of intimate companionship with her reflected self was gone. The 2 mirror women were strangers, silently watching her. Defiantly, she stuck out her tongue. The 2 reflections grimaced menacingly. With a small cry, Flora ran to the switch, turned the screens on. They were seldom off after that. Sometimes, when the hammering of hooves became too wearying, or the shouting of comics too strident, she would blank them out and sit, back to the mirror walls, sipping a cup of hot cofflet and waiting. But they were always on when Harry arrived, sometimes glum, sometimes brisk and satisfied. He would settle himself in his chair, waiting patiently enough for dinner, watching the screens. "They're all right," he would declare, nodding. "Look at that, Flora. Look at the way that fellow whipped right across there. By golly, you've got to hand it to the full wall people." "Harry, where do they make the shows? The ones that show the beautiful scenery, the trees and rolling hills and mountains?" Harry was chewing. "Don't know," he said. "On location, I suppose." "Then there really are places like that. I mean, they aren't just making it up?" Harry stared at her, mouth full and half open. He grunted and resumed chewing. He swallowed. "I suppose that's another of your cracks." "I don't understand, Harry," Flora said. He took another bite, glanced sideways at her puzzled expression. "Of course they aren't making it up. How the devil could they make up a mountain?" "I'd like to see those places." "Here we go again," Harry said. "I was hoping I could enjoy a nice meal and then view a while, but I guess you're not going to allow that." Of course, Harry, I just said—" "I know what you said. Well, look at them then." He waved his hand at the screen. "There it is. The whole world. You can sit right here and view it all." "But I want to do more than just view it. I want to live it. I want to be in those places and feel leaves under my feet and have rain fall on my face." Harry frowned incredulously. "You mean you want to be an actress?" "No, of course not." "I don't know what you want. You have a home, 2 full walls, and this isn't all. I'm working towards something, Flora." Flora sighed. "Yes, Harry, I'm very lucky." "Darn right," Harry nodded emphatically, eyes on the screens. "Dial me another cofflet, will you?" The 3rd full wall came as a surprise. Flora had taken the 1100 car to the robo-clinic on the 478th level for her annual checkup. When she returned home, there it was. She hardly noticed the chorus of gasps cut off abruptly as the door shut in the faces of the other wives in the car. Flora stood, impressed in spite of herself by the fantastic panorama filling her apartment. Directly before her, the studio audience gaped up from the massed seats. A fat man in the front row reached inside a red plaid shirt to scratch. Flora could see the perspiration on his forehead. Farther back, a couple nuzzled, eyes on the stage. Who were they? Flora wondered. How did they manage to get out of their apartments and offices and sit in a real theatre? To the left, an owlish youth blinked from a brightly lit cage, and on the right, the MC caressed the mic, chattering. Flora deployed her chair, sank down, looking first this way, then that. There was so much going on, and she was in the middle of it. She watched for half an hour, then retracted the chair, deployed the bed. She was tired from the trip. A little nap. She stopped with the first zipper. The MC was staring directly at her, leering. The owlish youth blinked at her. The fat man scratched himself, staring up at her from the front row. She couldn't undress in front of all of them. She glanced around, located the switch near the door. With a click, the scene died around her. The glowing walls seemed to press close, fading slowly. Flora turned to the one remaining opaque wall, undressed slowly, her eyes on the familiar pictures. The children. She hadn't seen them since the last semi-annual vacation week. The cost of travel was so high, and the crowding. She turned to the bed, and the 3 mirror-bright walls confronted her. She stared at the pale figure before her, stark against the wall patched with its faded mementos. She took a step. On either side, an endless rank of gaunt, nude figures stepped in unison. She whirled, fixed her eyes gratefully on the familiar wall, the thin crevice outlining the door, the picture of the sea. She closed her eyes, groped her way to the bed. Once covered by the sheet, she opened her eyes. The beds stood in a row, all identical, each with its huddled figure like an infinite charity ward, she thought, or like a morgue where all the world lay dead. Harry munched his yeast chop, his head moving from side to side as he followed the action across the 3 walls. "It's marvellous, Flora, marvellous! But it can be better yet," he added mysteriously. "Harry, couldn't we move to a bigger place, and maybe do away with 2 other walls? Flora, you know better than that. I'm lucky to have gotten this apartment when I did. There's nothing, absolutely nothing available." He chuckled. "In a way, the situation is good job insurance. You know, I couldn't be fired, even if the company wanted to. They couldn't get a replacement. A man can't very well take a job if he hasn't a place to live in the city. And I can sit on this place as long as I like. We might get tired of issue rations, but by God, we could hold on. So not that anybody's in danger of getting fired." "We could move out of the city, Harry. When I was a girl—" "Oh, not again," Harry groaned. "I thought that was all threshed out long ago." He fixed a pained look on Flora. "Try to understand, Flora. The population of the world has doubled since you were a girl. Do you realize what that means? There are more people alive now than had been born in all previous human history up to 50 years ago. That farm you remember visiting as a kid, it's all paved now. There are tall buildings there. The highways you remember, full of private autos, all driving across open country, they're all gone. There aren't any highways or any open country except the TV settings and a few estates like the President's acre and a half. Not that any sun hits it, with all those buildings around it, and maybe some essential dry land farms for stuff they can't synthesize or get from the sea." "There has to be some place we can go. It wasn't meant that people should spend their lives like this, away from the sun, the sea." A shadow crossed Harry's face. "I can remember things too, Flora," he said softly. "We spent a week at the beach once, when I was a small boy. I remember getting up at dawn with the sky all pink and purple and going down to the water's edge. There were little creatures in the sand, little wild things. I could see tiny fish darting along in a wave crest just before it broke. I could feel the sand with my toes. The gulls sailed around overhead, and there was even a tree. But it's gone now. There isn't any beach anywhere. That's all over." He broke off. "Never mind. That was then. This is now. They've paved the beach and built processing plants on it, and they've paved the farms and the parks and the gardens. But they've given us full wall to make up for it, and—" There was a buzz from the door. Harry got to his feet. "They're here, Flora. Wait till you see." Something seemed to tighten around Flora's throat as the men emerged from the lift, gingerly handling the great roll of wall screen. "Harry?" "4 walls," Harry said triumphantly. "I told you I was working towards something, remember? Well, this is it. By God, the Harry Trimbles have shown them." "Harry, I can't. Not 4 walls." "I know you're a little overwhelmed, but you deserve it, Flora." "Harry, I don't want 4 walls. I can't stand it. It will be all around me." Harry stepped to her side, gripped her wrist fiercely. "Shut up," he hissed. "Do you want the workmen to think you're out of your mind?" He grinned at the men. "How about a cofflet, boys?" "You kidding?" one inquired. The other went silently about the work of rolling out the panel, attaching contact strips. Another reached for the sea scene. "No!" Flora threw herself against the wall, as though to cover the pictures with her body. "You can't take my pictures! Harry, don't let them!" "Look, sister, I don't want your crummy pictures." "Flora, get hold of yourself. Here, I'll help you put the pictures in your floor locker." "Bunch of nuts," one of the men muttered. "Here, keep a civil tongue in your head," Harry started. The man who had spoken stepped up to him. He was taller than Harry and solidly built. "Any more crap out of you, and I'll break you in half. You and the old bag, shut up and keep out of my way. I got a job to do." Harry sat beside Flora, his face white with fury. "You and your vapourings," he hissed. "So I have to endure this. I have a good mind to—" He trailed off. The men finished and left with all 4 walls blaring. "Harry," Flora's voice shook, "how will you get out? They've put it right across the door. They've sealed us in." "Don't be a bigger idiot than you have to." Harry's voice was ugly over the thunder from the screens. He went to the newly covered wall, groped, found the tiny pin switch. At a touch, it slid aside as always, revealing the blank face of the lift shaft safety door. A moment later, it too slid aside, and Harry forced his way into the car. Flora caught a glimpse of his flushed, angry face as the door closed. Around her, the walls roared. A saloon fight was in full swing. She ducked as a chair sailed toward her, whirled to see it smash down a man behind her. Shots rang out. Men ran this way and that. The noise was deafening. That man, Flora thought, the vicious one. He had set it too loud, purposely. The scene shifted. Horses galloped across the room. Dust clouds rose, nearly choking her in the verisimilitude of the illusion. It was as though she crouched under a small square canopy of ceiling in the middle of the immense plain. Now there were cattle, wild-eyed, with tossing horns, bellowing, thundering in an unbroken sea across the screens, charging at Flora out of the wall, pouring past her on left and right. She screamed, shut her eyes, and ran blindly to the wall, groping for the switch. The uproar subsided. Flora gasped in relief, her head humming. She felt faint, dizzy. She had to lie down. Everything was going black around her. The glowing walls swirled, fading. Flora sank to the floor. Later. Perhaps a few minutes, maybe hours. She had no way of knowing. Flora sat up. She looked out across an infinite vista of tile floor, which swept away to the distant horizon in all directions as far as the eye could see, and over all that vast plain, hollow-eyed women crouched at intervals of 15 feet in endless numbers, waiting. Flora stared into the eyes of the nearest reflection. It stared back, a stranger. She moved her head quickly to try and catch a glimpse of the next woman, but no matter how fast she moved, the nearer woman anticipated her, interposing her face between Flora and all the others. Flora turned. A cold-eyed woman guarded this rank too. "Please," Flora heard herself pleading. "Please, please." She bit her lip, eyes shut. She had to get hold of herself. These were only mirrors. She knew that. Only mirrors. The other women, they were mere reflections, even the hostile ones who hid the others. They were herself, mirrored in the walls. She opened her eyes. She knew there were joints in the glassy wall. All she had to do was find them, and the illusion of the endless plain would collapse. There, that thin black line, like a wire stretched from floor to ceiling, that was a corner of the room. She was not lost in an infinitude of weeping women on a vast plain. She was right there, in her own apartment, alone. She turned, finding the other corners. They were all there, all visible. She knew what they were. But why did they continue to look like wires, setting apart the squares of floor, each with its silent, grieving occupant? She closed her eyes again, fighting down the panic. She would tell Harry. As soon as he came home, it was only a few hours, she would explain it to him. "I'm sick, Harry. You have to send me away to some place where I'll lie in a real bed, with sheets and blankets, beside an open window, looking out across fields and forests. Someone kind, will bring me a tray with a bowl of soup, real soup, made from real chickens and with real bread, and even a glass of milk, and a napkin made of real cloth." She should find her bed and deploy it, and rest there until Harry came, but she was so tired. It was better to wait here, just relaxing, not thinking about the immense floor and the other women who waited with her. She slept. When she awoke, she sat up, confused. There had been a dream. But how strange! The walls of the cell block were transparent now. She could see all the other apartments, stretching away to every side. She nodded. It was as she thought. They were all as barren and featureless as her own. And Harry was wrong. They all had 4 full walls, and the other women, the other wives, shut up like her in these small, mean cells, they were all aging and sick and faded, starved for fresh air and sunshine. She nodded again, and the woman in the next apartment nodded in sympathy. All the women were nodding. They all agreed. Poor things. When Harry came, she would show him how it was. He would see that the full walls weren't enough. They all had them, and they were all unhappy. When Harry came, it was time now. She knew it. After so many years, you didn't need a watch to tell when Harry was due. She had better get up, make herself presentable. She rose unsteadily to her feet. The other husbands were coming too, Flora noted. All the wives were getting ready. They moved about, opening their floor lockers, patting at their hair, slipping into another dress. Flora went to the diner ration, and all around, in all the apartments, the wives deployed the tables and dialed the dinners. She tried to see what the woman next door was dialing, but it was too far. She laughed at the way her neighbour craned to see what she was preparing. The other woman laughed too. She was a good sport. "Kelpies," Flora called cheerily, "and mock spam and cofflet." Dinner was ready now. Flora turned to the door wall and waited. Harry would be so pleased at not having to wait. Then, after dinner, she'd explain about her illness. Was it the right wall she was waiting before? The line around the door was so fine you couldn't really see it. She laughed at how funny it would be if Harry came in and found her standing, staring at the wrong wall. She turned and saw a movement on her left, in the next apartment. Flora watched as the door opened. A man stepped in. The next-door woman went forward to meet him. To meet Harry. It was Harry! Flora whirled. Her 4 walls stood blank and glassy, while all around her the other wives greeted Harry, seated him at their tables, and offered him cofflet. "Harry!" she screamed, throwing herself at the wall. It threw her back. She ran to the next wall, hammering, screaming, "Harry! Harry!" In all the other apartments, Harry chewed, nodded, smiled. The other wives pawed, fussed over Harry, nibbled daintily, and none of them, not one of them, paid the slightest attention to her. She stood in the centre of the room, not screaming now, only sobbing silently. In the 4 glass walls that enclosed her, she stood alone. There was no point in calling any longer. No matter how she screamed, how she beat against the walls, or how she called for Harry, she knew that no one would ever hear.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. Science fiction and fantasy and horror, oh my!